This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as I approached the small convenience store attached to the pumps. Through the grimy windows, I could make out a lone figure behind the counter. I pushed open the door, wincing at the shrill chime that announced my presence. The stench hit me immediately, a nauseating mix of rotting meat and stale cigarettes that made my stomach churn. I fought the urge to gag as I cautiously made my way towards the register. The clerk stood motionless, his back to me. "Excuse me," I called out hesitantly. "I need to pay for some gas." Slowly, the man turned to face me. My blood ran cold. His eyes were glassy and unfocused, darting erratically around the room. An unsettling grin stretched across his gaunt face as he began mumbling under his breath. Fresh meat. The harvest is bountiful tonight." I took an involuntary step back, my heart pounding. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I was frozen in place. The clerk's twitching intensified as he fixed his gaze on me, that horrific smile growing wider. "You'll do nicely," he rasped, reaching a bony hand towards me. "So plump and juicy." I stumbled backwards, knocking over a display of snacks. The clattering seemed to snap me out of my daze, and I bolted for the door. But the clerk was faster than I expected. His fingers grazed the back of my jacket as I wrenched the door open and sprinted into the night. The gravel crunched under my feet as I raced towards my car. I could hear the clerk's uneven footsteps and ragged breathing behind me, getting closer with each passing second. Frantically, I fumbled for my keys. Just as I reached for the door handle, a hand clamped down on my shoulder. I screamed and whirled around, lashing out blindly. My fist connected with something solid, and I heard a sickening crunch. The clerk stumbled back, blood gushing from his now crooked nose. I seized the opportunity and dove into my car, jamming the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life just as the clerk slammed into the driver's side window. His bloodied face pressed against the glass, teeth bared in a feral snarl. I threw the car into reverse and stomped on the gas. The tires squealed as I peeled out of the lot, nearly hitting one of the pumps in my haste to escape. In my rearview mirror, I could see the clerk chasing after me on foot, moving with an unnatural speed. My hands shook as I sped down the highway, constantly checking behind me to make sure I wasn't being followed. It wasn't until I had put several miles between myself and that nightmarish gas station that I finally allowed myself to breathe. As the adrenaline faded, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. What the hell was wrong with that clerk? The way he moved, the things he said, it was like something out of a horror movie. And that smell, I gagged at the memory. I considered calling the police, but what would I even say? I had no proof, and my story sounded insane even to my own ears. Who would believe me? It wasn't until I reached the next town that I finally pulled over, my nerves shot. As I sat there trying to calm down, a news alert popped up on my phone. My blood ran cold as I read the headline, "Serial Killer Escapes from Nearby Mental Hospital." With trembling fingers, I scrolled through the article. A dangerous patient had overpowered a guard and escaped earlier that evening. He was known for stalking remote areas and, my stomach lurched, cannibalizing his victims. The grainy mugshot at the bottom of the page confirmed my worst fears. It was him, the clerk from the gas station. I immediately called 911, my words tumbling out in a frantic rush as I recounted my experience. The dispatcher assured me that units were already searching the area and urged me to come to the station to give a formal statement. As I drove to the police station, my mind raced. How close had I come to becoming another victim? The memory of his touch, his sickening words, made my skin crawl. I knew I would be haunted by this night for a long time to come. At the station, I gave my statement to a sympathetic detective. She informed me that based on my information, they were sending additional units to search the gas station and surrounding area. I felt a mix of relief and lingering fear as I recounted every chilling detail. Hours later, utterly exhausted, I checked into a motel for the night. Sleep eluded me as I replayed the terrifying encounter over and over in my mind. Every sound made me jump, convinced that somehow he had found me. It wasn't until the next afternoon that I got an update from the detective. They had searched the gas station but found no sign of the escaped killer. However, they did discover something disturbing in a hidden room behind the store: decomposing human remains. I felt sick as the detective explained that it appeared the killer had been using the remote location as a base of operations for weeks, luring in unsuspecting travelers. If I hadn't managed to escape, I shuddered at the thought. In the days that followed, I struggled to process what had happened. Nightmares plagued my sleep, filled with glassy eyes and the stench of decay. I jumped at every shadow, convinced that at any moment he would appear to finish what he started. The police never managed to locate the escaped killer. Despite an extensive manhunt, he seemed to have vanished into thin air. The idea that he was still out there, possibly targeting other innocent people, filled me with dread. I found myself obsessively checking the news, searching for any updates or sightings. But as the weeks passed with no new information, my anxiety slowly began to fade. I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, I had truly escaped. Looking back now, I still can't fully explain what happened that night. Was it simply a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or was there something more sinister at play? The memory of his inhuman movements and that horrific smile still send chills down my spine. I've since moved to a new city, desperate for a fresh start, but I can never shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I swear I catch a glimpse of a gaunt figure with glassy eyes, and on quiet nights, I can almost hear that raspy voice whispering, "Fresh meat." I know it's probably just paranoia, my mind playing tricks on me, but a part of me wonders, did I truly escape that night? Or am I just living on borrowed time, waiting for the day he finally catches up to me? One thing's for certain, I'll never stop at another remote gas station again. The risk is simply too great. So if you find yourself on a lonely stretch of highway late at night, think twice before pulling over. You never know what kind of nightmares might be waiting for you in the darkness. The road was winding and narrow, barely wide enough for 2 cars to pass. Tall trees loomed on either side, their branches creating an eerie canopy overhead that blocked out most of the moonlight. I had my high beams on, but they didn't do much to penetrate the inky blackness beyond the first few feet in front of my car. I was about halfway through the forest when I saw something up ahead that made my blood run cold. There were dark figures standing in the middle of the road, completely blocking the way forward. As I got closer, I could make out that they were wearing creepy masks, like something out of a horror movie. My first instinct was to slam on the brakes, but I was afraid of skidding on the wet leaves covering the road. I eased off the gas instead, hoping maybe they would move out of the way. But they didn't budge an inch. Heart pounding, I came to a stop about 20 feet away from them. There were 4 of them, all wearing different grotesque masks that obscured their entire faces. One had what looked like a demon mask, another a witch, the third some kind of twisted clown, and the last one a skull. For a few agonizing seconds, we just stared at each other in silence. I was paralyzed with fear, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. A million thoughts raced through my head. Who were these people? What did they want? Should I try to reverse and get out of there? Before I could make a move, the one in the demon mask stepped forward and gestured for me to roll down my window. Every instinct screamed at me not to, but I was terrified of angering them. With a shaking hand, I lowered the window a few inches. "Turn off your engine and get out of the car," the demon-masked figure said in a low, menacing voice. Why? What do you want?" I stammered. "Do it now, or we'll smash your windows and drag you out," he growled. I knew I was in serious trouble. My mind raced, trying to figure out a way out of this nightmare, but they had me completely boxed in. Even if I tried to reverse, the road was so narrow, I'd likely end up in a ditch before I could turn around. Trembling, I turned off the engine. The silence of the forest suddenly felt deafening. I could hear my own ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart. Phone and wallet, now. The clown-masked one had approached my window and was holding out a gloved hand. I fumbled in my pockets, my fingers feeling numb and clumsy. I handed over my phone and wallet, praying they would just take them and leave. But of course it wasn't going to be that easy. "Get out," the demon mask repeated. Tears pricked at my eyes as I slowly opened the door. My legs felt like jelly as I stood up. The masked figures surrounded me, silent and menacing. I'd never felt so small and vulnerable in my life. "On your knees," the skull mask ordered. I hesitated for a split second, which earned me a hard shove that sent me sprawling onto the wet ground. Leaves and twigs dug into my palms and knees. "Please," I begged, my voice breaking. "I don't have anything else. Just take my car and let me go." The witch mask leaned down, getting right in my face. Even in the darkness, I could see their eyes glinting coldly through the eye holes of the mask. "Oh, we're just getting started," they said in a voice that made my skin crawl. For the next hour, though it felt like an eternity, they toyed with me like a cat playing with a mouse. They never actually hurt me physically, but the psychological torment was unbearable. They'd circle around me, sometimes getting uncomfortably close, other times disappearing into the woods, only to suddenly reappear. They asked me deeply personal questions about my family, my fears, my deepest secrets. When I hesitated or tried to lie, they seemed to know and would punish me with terrifying mind games. At one point, the demon mask produced a wicked-looking knife and spent several long minutes sharpening it right next to my ear while describing in vivid detail how they could use it on me. I was shaking uncontrollably, tears and snot running down my face. I'd never been so scared in my life. I truly believed I was going to die out there in those dark woods. Just when I thought I couldn't take any more, something changed. The masked figures all froze, like they were listening to something I couldn't hear. Then, without a word, they melted back into the forest and vanished. I stayed there on my knees for several long minutes, afraid to move in case it was another trick. But the forest remained silent and still. Eventually, I staggered to my feet and stumbled back to my car. My phone and wallet were sitting on the hood. With trembling hands, I grabbed them and got back in the car. It took me 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. As soon as the engine roared to life, I slammed it into drive and got the hell out of there as fast as I could. I didn't stop driving until I reached the campus police station. I burst in, still shaking and crying, and tried to explain what had happened. They took my statement and sent out patrols. But of course they found nothing. To this day, I don't know who those masked people were or what they really wanted. Were they just sadistic thrill seekers who got off on terrorizing random drivers? Was it some kind of bizarre initiation ritual for a secret society? Or something even darker that I can't begin to comprehend? All I know is that the experience changed me forever. I have terrible nightmares and panic attacks. I can't be alone in the dark anymore. And I sure as hell never take shortcuts through the forest, no matter how much time it might save. Some risks just aren't worth taking. I've tried to tell myself that maybe it was all some elaborate prank. But deep down, I know it wasn't. The terror I felt that night was all too real. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I swear I can still hear the rustle of leaves and see those blank mask eyes staring at me from the shadows. About halfway through my journey, I came around a sharp bend and saw a car pulled over on the shoulder, hazard lights blinking. As I got closer, I could make out the figure of a woman waving her arms frantically. My first instinct was to keep driving. It was late, I was alone, and this stretch of road gave me the creeps. But I couldn't just leave someone stranded out here in the middle of nowhere. What if she was in real trouble? I slowed down and pulled over about 20 feet behind her car. As I put my hazards on, I took a deep breath to calm my nerves. "You're just being paranoid," I told myself. "She probably just has a flat tire or ran out of gas." I grabbed my phone and stepped out of the car, keeping my keys in my hand. As I approached, I could see the woman more clearly. She looked to be in her mid-30s, with long dark hair and a pretty face etched with distress. She was wearing jeans and a light jacket, not exactly prepared for a nighttime breakdown. "Oh, thank God," she exclaimed as I got closer. "I've been out here for hours, and you're the first car that stopped. My car just died on me, and I have no cell service. Can you please call for a tow truck?" Her story seemed plausible enough, but something still felt off. Why was she standing so far from her car? And was that movement I saw in the back seat? Before I could process these thoughts, I felt a sharp pain in the back of my head. The world went fuzzy and started to spin. As I crumpled to the ground, the last thing I saw was the woman's face, no longer distraught, but wearing a cold, cruel smile. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I came to, my head was throbbing and I couldn't see anything. It took me a moment to realize I had a hood over my head. My hands were bound behind my back, and I could feel the vibrations of a moving vehicle. Panic set in as the reality of my situation became clear. I had been kidnapped. I tried to stay calm and assess my surroundings. I was lying on what felt like the floor of a van or SUV. The air was stuffy and smelled of cigarette smoke. I could hear at least 2 voices speaking in low tones, but couldn't make out what they were saying. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened. The woman by the road must have been working with someone else. While she distracted me, her partner snuck up and knocked me out. But why? Were they going to rob me, hold me for ransom, or something even worse? I don't know how long we drove for. It felt like hours, but time loses all meaning when you're blindfolded in the back of a kidnapper's vehicle. Eventually, I felt the car slow down and turn onto what seemed like a dirt road. The ride got bumpier, and I was tossed around painfully. When we finally came to a stop, I heard car doors opening and footsteps approaching. Rough hands grabbed me and hauled me to my feet. I was dizzy and disoriented as they dragged me out of the vehicle. The hood was still on, but I could tell we were outside from the cool night air on my skin. "Walk," a gruff male voice commanded, shoving me forward. I stumbled blindly, my captors guiding me none too gently. After what felt like about 50 yards, we stopped, and I heard the creak of a heavy door opening. They pushed me inside and forced me down into a chair. My ankles were bound to the legs, and the hood was finally yanked off. I blinked rapidly, my eyes struggling to adjust to the dim light. As my vision cleared, I took in my surroundings with growing horror. I was in some kind of abandoned warehouse or factory. Dusty machinery and broken crates were scattered about. The windows were boarded up, and the only light came from a few bare bulbs hanging from the ceiling. And there, standing before me, were my kidnappers. The woman from the road stood off to the side, looking bored as she scrolled through a phone. My phone, I realized with a jolt. Next to her was a huge, muscular man with a shaved head and a face like a pit bull. But it was the third person who drew my attention and made my blood run cold. He was average height and build, dressed all in black, but his face was covered by a white mask with crudely painted features. The empty black eyes bored into me as he stepped forward. Well, looks like our little mouse is finally awake," he said, his voice muffled slightly by the mask. "Did you have a nice nap?" I wanted to say something defiant, to demand they let me go. But my throat was dry with fear, and all that came out was a strangled whimper. The masked man chuckled. "Oh, come now, no need to be scared. We're all friends here. Well, maybe not friends exactly. More like business associates. You see, you're going to help us with a little project of ours." He turned to the woman. "Anything useful on his phone?" She shook her head. "Nah, just the usual crap. No banking apps or anything good." "Shame," the masked man sighed. He faced me again. "Well, my friend, it seems you're not going to be as valuable as we hoped. But don't worry, I'm sure we can still find a use for you." The way he said it made my skin crawl. What were they planning to do with me? I struggled against my bonds, but they were tied too tightly. Now, none of that," the masked man tutted. He pulled out a wickedly sharp knife and held it up to the light. "We wouldn't want there to be any accidents." I froze, my eyes locked on the gleaming blade. The man laughed and used it to slowly cut away my shirt, the cold metal dragging across my skin. I flinched each time it nicked me, drawing tiny beads of blood. "You know, I always enjoy this part," he mused as he worked. "The fear in their eyes, the trembling, the pleading. It's intoxicating, but you're being awfully quiet. Cat got your tongue?" I swallowed hard, trying to find my voice. "Please," I managed to croak out. "Just let me go. I won't tell anyone, I swear." The masked man paused, tilting his head as if considering my words. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Then he burst out laughing. "Oh, that's rich," he cackled, "as if we'd just let you waltz out of here. No, I'm afraid you're stuck with us for the duration, however long that may be." He finished cutting away my shirt and stepped back to admire his handiwork. I sat there shivering, my chest covered in small cuts and streaks of blood. The masked man nodded approvingly. Not bad at all," he murmured. "But I think we can do better, don't you?" He turned to his companions. "What do you say we have a little fun with our new friend here?" The big man cracked his knuckles and grinned menacingly. The woman just shrugged, looking bored. "Whatever, just don't make too much of a mess. I'm not cleaning it up this time." As they advanced on me, I closed my eyes and silently prayed for a miracle. I didn't know if I would survive the night, but I knew that whatever happened, I would never be the same. The next few hours were a blur of pain and terror. They took turns torturing me, each with their own sick methods. The masked man seemed to favor his knife, carving intricate patterns into my skin. The big guy preferred his fists, pummeling me until I could barely breathe. Even the woman got in on it, burning me with cigarettes and whispering horrible things in my ear. Through it all, I tried to retreat into my mind, to distance myself from what was happening to my body. I thought of my family, my friends, all the things I wished I had said and done. I resigned myself to the fact that I was probably going to die in this hellhole. But then, something changed. Maybe they got bored, or maybe they had other victims to attend to. Whatever the reason, they eventually left me alone, slumped in the chair and drifting in and out of consciousness. I don't know how long I sat there in the dark. Hours, probably, though it felt like days. My entire body ached, and I was weak from blood loss and dehydration. But slowly, painfully, my mind began to clear, and with that clarity came a fierce determination to survive. I started working at my bonds, ignoring the pain as the ropes cut into my raw wrists. It was slow going, but eventually I felt them start to loosen. Hope surged through me, giving me renewed energy. Just as I managed to slip one hand free, I heard footsteps approaching. Panic gripped me. If they caught me trying to escape, I didn't want to imagine what they'd do. I held perfectly still, my free hand hidden behind my back. The door creaked open and the woman sauntered in, lighting a cigarette. She glanced at me dismissively before turning her back to fiddle with something on a nearby table. This was my chance. Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I lunged forward. The chair toppled and I crashed into her, sending us both sprawling. She let out a startled shriek as we grappled on the floor. Despite my injuries, adrenaline and desperation gave me the edge. I managed to get on top of her, pinning her down. "Where are the keys?" I growled, my hands around her throat. Her eyes went wide with fear as she realized the tables had turned. She gestured weakly towards the table. I scrambled over and found a ring of keys. After a frantic moment, I located the one for my ankle restraints and freed myself. The woman was starting to get up, so I grabbed a piece of broken machinery and brought it down on her head. She crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Heart pounding, I crept to the door and peered out. The warehouse seemed deserted. The others must have gone somewhere. This might be my only chance. I made my way through the building as quickly and quietly as I could, jumping at every shadow. When I finally found an exit, I almost cried with relief. I burst out into the cool night air, gulping it down like a drowning man. In the distance, I could see lights, a town or city of some kind. Freedom and safety were within reach. I took off running, ignoring the pain that flared with every step. I didn't know how long I had before they realized I was gone, but I wasn't going to waste a second. As I ran, the horrors of the past day began to fade like a bad dream. All that mattered now was putting as much distance between me and that warehouse as possible. I knew I would be forever changed by what had happened to me, but in that moment, with the wind on my face and hope in my heart, I felt truly alive. I don't know how long I ran for. My legs were on fire and my lungs felt like they would burst, but I didn't dare stop. Every rustle in the bushes, every snapping twig made me flinch, certain my captors were right behind me. But slowly, steadily, the lights grew closer. As I neared the outskirts of what I now saw was a small town, my adrenaline began to fade. The full extent of my injuries hit me like a truck, and I stumbled, nearly falling. But I forced myself to keep moving. I was so close I couldn't give up now. I staggered into town, a bloody, half-naked wreck. A few early morning joggers and dog walkers stared in shock. I must have looked like something out of a horror movie. But I didn't care about their stares. All I cared about was finding help. I spotted a gas station up ahead, its fluorescent lights a beacon of hope. With the last of my strength, I lurched towards it. As I reached the door, my legs finally gave out and I collapsed. The last thing I remember is the concerned face of the clerk leaning over me, phone in hand as he called 911. Then blessed darkness took me. I woke up in the hospital 2 days later. The police had been notified and were investigating, but I knew it was unlikely they'd find anything. My captors were clearly professionals. They would have cleared out of that warehouse long ago. As I recovered physically, I struggled to process what had happened to me. The doctors kept telling me how lucky I was to be alive, but I didn't feel lucky. I felt broken, violated in ways I couldn't even begin to describe. Nightmares plagued me every time I closed my eyes. I would wake up screaming, convinced I was back in that chair with the masked man standing over me. Even after I was released from the hospital, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every stranger on the street became a potential threat. It's been months now, and I'm still trying to put my life back together. Therapy helps, but there are some scars that will never fully heal. I jump at sudden noises and can't stand to be in dark or enclosed spaces. Driving at night is completely out of the question, but I'm alive. I survived, and every day I'm getting a little stronger. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again, but I refuse to let them win by living in fear forever. I'm sharing my story now as a warning to others. Please be careful out there. If something doesn't feel right, trust your instincts. Don't make the same mistake I did, because the monsters are real and they're closer than you think. That's when I spotted him. A lone figure on the shoulder, thumb stuck out. Against my better judgment, I decided to pull over. Maybe some conversation would help keep me alert for the last leg of my trip. As I slowed to a stop, I got a better look at the hitchhiker. He was a wiry guy, probably in his 30s, with stringy hair and a scraggly beard. His clothes were dirty and ragged. But hey, I wasn't exactly looking my Sunday best after 2 weeks on the road either. "Where are you headed?" I called out as he approached the passenger side. "Just up the road a ways," he replied with a crooked grin. "Appreciate the lift, man." I nodded and motioned for him to hop in. As he clambered up into the cab, a whiff of body odor hit me. The guy clearly hadn't showered in a while, but I'd smelled worse in my years of long-haul driving. We rode in silence for a few minutes as I focused on the road ahead. I could feel his eyes on me, studying me intently. It was starting to make me uneasy. "So, what's your name?" I asked, trying to break the tension. "Jim," he grunted. "I'm Dave. Where you coming from, Jim?" He was quiet for a moment before answering. "Nowhere special, just drifting." I nodded, unsure how to continue the conversation. The silence stretched on, punctuated only by the hum of the engine and the thrum of tires on asphalt. Suddenly Jim spoke up. "Mind if I smoke?" "Sorry, man, no smoking in the cab," I replied. Company policy was strict about that. He grunted in response, clearly annoyed. I saw him fidgeting out of the corner of my eye, hands twitching restlessly. The hairs on the back of my neck started to stand up. Something wasn't right here. That's when I felt the cold metal of a gun barrel pressed against my ribs. "Pull over, now." Jim's voice was low and menacing. My heart started racing. This couldn't be happening. "Look, man, I don't want any trouble," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just take my wallet and—" "I said pull over," he snarled, jabbing the gun harder into my side. Hands shaking, I eased the big rig onto the shoulder. My mind was reeling, trying to figure a way out of this. As soon as we came to a stop, Jim grabbed a fistful of my shirt. "Out of the truck! Move it!" I raised my hands, trying to appear non-threatening. Okay, just stay calm." As I opened the door and started to climb down, I saw my chance. I suddenly shoved backwards with all my strength, catching Jim off guard. The gun went off, the shot deafening in the enclosed cab. My ears ringing, I scrambled out of the truck and took off running into the darkness. I could hear Jim cursing and fumbling to follow. My legs were burning as I sprinted across the uneven ground, heart pounding in my chest. A shot rang out behind me, and I felt something whiz past my ear. Panic gave me an extra burst of speed as I zigzagged, trying to make myself a harder target. Up ahead I could see the glow of lights, some kind of rest stop or gas station. If I could just make it there. Another shot, this one kicking up dirt by my feet. I risked a glance back and saw Jim's shadowy form gaining on me. He was faster than he looked. Lungs burning, I pushed myself harder. The lights were getting closer, just a little further. Suddenly my foot caught on something and I went sprawling, hitting the ground hard. Before I could get up, a weight slammed into my back, driving the air from my lungs. Rough hands grabbed me, flipping me over. Jim's face loomed over me, twisted in a snarl. "Thought you could get away, huh?" He raised the gun, aiming it at my head. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the end. The gunshot never came. Instead, I heard a meaty thud and a grunt of pain. My eyes flew open to see Jim crumpling to the ground, a dark figure standing over him with a tire iron raised. "You okay, buddy?" a gruff voice asked. As my eyes adjusted, I saw it was another trucker, a burly guy with a thick beard. I nodded shakily, too out of breath to speak. The man reached down to help me up. "Saw you running from the highway. Figured something was wrong." Thank you," I managed to gasp out. He tried to." "I get it," the man said. "Let's get you inside and call the cops." As we walked towards the truck stop, my legs felt like jelly. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the reality of what just happened was sinking in. I'd nearly died out here on this lonely stretch of road. The next few hours passed in a blur. Police arrived to take my statement and arrest Jim, who was still unconscious when they got there. The trucker who saved me, whose name I learned was Bill, stayed with me the whole time, even bought me a cup of coffee while I gave my report. It was nearly dawn by the time everything was wrapped up. As I climbed back into my rig, still shaken but determined to finish my run, Bill clapped me on the shoulder. "Be careful out there," he said. "Never know what kind of crazies you might run into." I nodded gratefully. Believe me, I've learned my lesson. No more picking up hitchhikers. As I pulled back onto the highway, the first rays of sunlight were peeking over the horizon. I'd be more wary of strangers from now on, but I was also heartened by Bill's actions. There were still good people out there, willing to help a stranger in need. The open road stretched out before me as I settled in for the last leg of my journey. I had a newfound appreciation for the safety of my cab, and a story I'd be telling for years to come. But most of all, I was just grateful to be alive. A figure emerged from the shadows, hunched against the rain. As they approached, I could see it was a man in his 30s, wearing a dark hoodie pulled low over his face. He yanked open the back door and slid in quickly, slamming it behind him. "Hey there," I said, trying to sound cheerful despite my fatigue. "Where to tonight?" The man mumbled an address on the outskirts of town. His voice was low and gravelly, setting me on edge. As I pulled away from the curb, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The passenger was sitting rigidly, staring straight ahead. His hands were clenched into tight fists on his knees. An uneasy feeling crept over me. In my 2 years as a rideshare driver, I'd encountered all types of passengers: drunk college kids, business people on phones, chatty tourists. But something about this guy felt off. I tried to make conversation as we drove, commenting on the nasty weather and asking if he was heading home from work. The man only grunted in response, clearly not interested in small talk. Fair enough, I thought. Some people just want a quiet ride. As we left the city center, the streets grew darker and more deserted. The rain intensified, pounding against the roof of the car. I leaned forward, squinting to see through the sheets of water cascading down the windshield. Suddenly, I felt something press against the back of my seat. Glancing in the mirror again, I saw the man had leaned forward, his face now clearly visible in the glow of a passing streetlight. His eyes were wide and wild-looking, darting back and forth. "Everything okay back there?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Pull over," the man said abruptly. "Sorry, what was that?" I said, "Pull over, now." His tone left no room for argument. My heart began to race. We were on a lonely stretch of road with no other cars in sight. Panic rising in my throat, I stammered, "Sir, I can't just stop here. We're almost to your destination." Before I could finish, the man lunged forward, grabbing the steering wheel. The car swerved violently as I fought to maintain control. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted, struggling against his grip. "Shut up and pull over," he snarled, his face contorted with rage. In the chaos, I didn't see the upcoming turn. We careened off the road, tires screeching as we fishtailed on the wet pavement. I slammed on the brakes, bringing us to a jolting stop inches from a ditch. The man immediately reached for the door handle, but in his frenzy, he'd forgotten to unlock it. Those precious seconds gave me a chance to react. I threw the car into drive and floored the accelerator, tires spinning in the mud before finding purchase. As we lurched forward, the man grabbed me around the neck, trying to wrench me out of my seat. I gasped for air, vision blurring as his arm tightened. With one hand on the wheel, I clawed at his grip with the other. "Stop the fucking car," he screamed in my ear. Summoning every ounce of strength, I jerked the wheel hard to the right. The sudden movement caught him off guard. His grip loosened just enough for me to suck in a desperate breath. We careened down the road, swerving erratically as I fought to stay conscious. Rain lashed against the windshield, obscuring my view. I had no idea where we were or if we were about to crash. In a last-ditch effort, I slammed on the brakes and threw the car into park. The sudden stop sent us both lurching forward. My attacker's head smacked against the back of my seat, momentarily stunning him. I seized the opportunity, fumbling to unbuckle my seatbelt with trembling hands. I threw open the driver's side door and tumbled out onto the muddy shoulder of the road. Adrenaline surging, I scrambled to my feet and took off running. I could hear the man shouting and the sound of my car door slamming behind me. My legs pumped furiously as I sprinted through the downpour, not daring to look back. After what felt like miles, I spotted lights ahead, a 24-hour gas station. I burst through the doors, startling the sleepy-looking clerk behind the counter. "Please," I gasped, "call the police. Someone tried to attack me." The next few hours passed in a blur. Police arrived to take my statement. They searched the area but found no sign of my attacker or my car. I was taken to the hospital to be checked for injuries, then spent hours at the police station filing reports. By the time I finally made it home, watery daylight was starting to break through the clouds. I collapsed into bed, utterly drained but too wired to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that man's crazed face lunging at me. In the days that followed, I jumped at every sound and shadow. I couldn't bring myself to drive again, let alone pick up another passenger. The police eventually located my abandoned car, but there were no fingerprints or evidence to identify the attacker. It's been months now, and I still have nightmares about that rainy night. I've left my rideshare driving days behind me. The extra cash wasn't worth the risk of encountering another unhinged stranger. Sometimes I wonder about that man, who he was, what he wanted, why he snapped. but mostly I'm just grateful I managed to escape. I shudder to think what might have happened if I hadn't reacted when I did. To my fellow drivers out there, please stay safe. Trust your instincts if a passenger seems off. And always have an escape plan, just in case. You never know when a routine ride could turn into a nightmare. I was a social worker for over a decade, but nothing in my training could have prepared me for what I encountered on that fateful day last spring. It started as a routine check-in at a remote farmhouse, the kind of visit I'd done hundreds of times before. The Millers were a quiet family who kept to themselves, living about an hour outside of town down a long dirt road. They had 2 young children, and I was following up on some concerns raised by their school teacher. As I pulled up the gravel driveway, I immediately sensed something was off. The usually well-kept yard was overgrown, and there were no signs of activity, no laundry on the line, no toys scattered about. An eerie silence hung in the air. My stomach knotted with unease as I approached the front porch. I knocked firmly on the door, but there was no response. After a few moments, I tried the handle and found it unlocked. "Hello?" I called out as I cautiously stepped inside. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller, it's Janet from Social Services. I'm here for our scheduled visit." The scene that greeted me inside the farmhouse will haunt me for the rest of my days. The living room was in complete disarray, furniture overturned, picture frames shattered on the floor, cushions and pillows torn apart. But it was the blood that made my breath catch in my throat. Dark red splatters and smears covered the walls and hardwood floor. A lamp lay broken in a pool of crimson. My heart pounding, I ventured further into the house, calling out again with increasing desperation. The kitchen was equally chaotic. Drawers yanked open, utensils and broken dishes strewn everywhere. More blood. So much blood. What in God's name had happened here? As I entered the narrow hallway leading to the bedrooms, I heard a soft whimpering sound. Adrenaline surging, I followed the noise to a small linen closet. With trembling hands, I slowly opened the door. Curled up inside, hidden behind some old blankets, was 8-year-old Emily Miller. Her eyes were wide with terror, her clothes stained with blood. When she saw me, she let out a strangled sob and scrambled even further back into the closet. "Emily, sweetheart," I said in the gentlest voice I could muster, "it's okay. I'm here to help you. Can you come out?" She shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. I crouched down to her level, my mind racing. I needed to get her out of here and contact the authorities immediately, but I couldn't risk traumatizing her further. "Emily, I know you're very scared right now, but I promise you're safe with me. I'm going to take you somewhere safe, okay? Can you be brave and come with me?" After what felt like an eternity, she gave a tiny nod. I helped her out of the closet, my heart breaking at how she trembled. I quickly wrapped her in a clean blanket I found, trying to shield her from the horrific scene around us. As we made our way back through the house, Emily clung to me like a lifeline. I tried to focus solely on getting her to safety, but my eyes couldn't help darting around, searching for any sign of what had befallen the rest of the family. There was no trace of Mr. and Mrs. Miller or Emily's younger brother. Once outside, I buckled Emily into the back seat of my car and locked the doors. My hands shook so badly I could barely dial 911 on my cell phone. I reported what I'd found in a breathless rush, begging them to send police and an ambulance immediately. While we waited, I did my best to comfort Emily. She was nearly catatonic, staring blankly ahead and flinching at every sound. I wanted desperately to ask her what had happened, but I knew better than to question a traumatized child before the authorities arrived. Instead, I simply held her hand and assured her over and over that she was safe now. The next few hours passed in a blur. The farmhouse became a hive of activity as police, paramedics, and forensics teams swarmed the property. I gave my statement countless times, recounting every detail I could remember. Emily was taken to the hospital for evaluation, and I insisted on accompanying her. I couldn't bear the thought of leaving her alone after what she'd been through. Days turned into weeks as the investigation unfolded. Despite extensive searches, no trace was ever found of Emily's parents or brother. The house revealed no clear answers, no signs of forced entry, no murder weapons, nothing to explain the horrific scene inside. Emily herself was unable or unwilling to speak about what had happened. The trauma had locked away her memories, perhaps mercifully. I visited Emily often in the children's psychiatric facility where she was placed. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to emerge from her shell. But even as she grew more talkative and engaged, she never spoke of that terrible day or her missing family. The few times I gently tried to broach the subject, she would shut down completely. Months have passed, and the case remains unsolved. The leading theory is that Mr. Miller suffered some kind of psychotic break and attacked his family, but without bodies or any real evidence, it's all speculation. Emily has been placed with a loving foster family, and I'm hopeful that with time and extensive therapy, she'll be able to heal and have a normal life. But I can't shake the lingering questions, the sense that we're missing some crucial piece of the puzzle. What force of violence descended on that quiet farmhouse? How did Emily survive when the others vanished without a trace? And perhaps most chillingly, could it happen again? I've handled hundreds of cases in my career, seen the darker side of humanity more times than I care to count, but nothing compares to the visceral horror of walking into that blood-splattered farmhouse. It shook my faith in the order of the world, in the thin veneer of safety we all cling to. Now, when I drive down lonely country roads past isolated farmhouses, I can't help but wonder what secrets might be hiding behind those walls, what invisible terrors might be unfolding, unknown to the outside world. The Millers seemed like such a normal, unremarkable family. If it could happen to them, I try to focus on the positives, that I was able to rescue Emily, that she has a chance at a new life. But in my darkest moments, I'm haunted by the things I don't know, by the realization that sometimes there are no answers, that violence can erupt suddenly and inexplicably, leaving nothing but questions in its wake. I still do my job, still check in on at-risk families, and do my best to help. But that day changed me fundamentally. I approach every case now with an undercurrent of dread, always half expecting to open a door and find another nightmare waiting on the other side. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that you can never truly know what goes on behind closed doors. That the most mundane visit can turn into unimaginable horror in the blink of an eye. And that some mysteries are destined to remain unsolved, leaving us to grapple with the knowledge that true evil exists in this world, senseless, unexplainable, and always lurking just out of sight. I was on a solo road trip through the southwestern United States, driving through vast stretches of desert landscape. The isolation and stark beauty of the terrain had always fascinated me, so I decided to take a detour off the main highway to explore some more remote areas. In hindsight, that decision nearly cost me my life. It was mid-July, and the heat was absolutely brutal. Even with the AC blasting, I could feel the oppressive temperatures seeping into my car. The dashboard thermometer read 110 degrees, and shimmering waves of heat distorted the horizon. I had been driving for hours without seeing another vehicle or any signs of civilization. Just endless sand, scrub brush, and rocky outcroppings as far as the eye could see. I was about 50 miles from the nearest town when my car suddenly started sputtering and losing power. With a sinking feeling in my stomach, I watched the fuel gauge needle drop to empty. How could I have been so careless? I thought I had plenty of gas to make it to the next town, but I must have miscalculated. Now here I was, stranded in the middle of nowhere with no cell signal and dwindling water supplies. For a few moments I sat there in stunned disbelief as panic started to set in. I took some deep breaths, trying to calm myself and think rationally. Okay, I had about half a bottle of water left. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. There was no way I could just wait in the car and hope someone would drive by. Who knows how long that could take in such a remote area? My only choice was to start walking and try to find help. I grabbed my nearly empty water bottle, put on my hat, and reluctantly stepped out of the car into the furnace-like heat. The temperature difference was like a physical blow. Sweat immediately began pouring down my face and back. I knew I had to conserve energy and water, so I set off at a steady pace, following the road and hoping I was going in the right direction. The first hour wasn't too bad. The adrenaline and determination to find help kept me going. But as time wore on, the relentless sun and heat began to take their toll. My mouth felt like sandpaper, and my head was pounding. I rationed tiny sips of water, but my supply was running dangerously low. After about 3 hours of walking, I was in rough shape. My vision was starting to blur, and I felt dizzy and disoriented. The landscape seemed to waver and shift around me. Was that shimmering in the distance a mirage, or could it be buildings? I stumbled forward, my feet feeling like lead weights. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I saw something that made my heart leap. A small, dilapidated gas station shimmered into view. At first, I was sure it must be a hallucination, but as I got closer, I realized it was real. Weathered pumps stood in front, and a faded sign creaked in the hot wind. With a burst of renewed energy, I staggered the last few hundred yards. Reaching the station, I collapsed against the door, my vision swimming. I dimly registered the sound of a bell jingling as I stumbled inside. The blast of air conditioning hit me like a wave of relief. I heard a startled exclamation, and then strong hands were guiding me to a chair. A concerned face swam into focus, an older man with weathered features, looking at me with alarm. "Jesus, son, what happened to you?" he asked, pressing a cold bottle of water into my hands. I gulped the water greedily, feeling life slowly returning to my parched body. Between sips, I managed to gasp out my story: the empty gas tank, the long walk through the desert. The man, whose name was Frank, listened with growing concern. "You're lucky to be alive," he said gravely. "I've seen what the desert can do to people who aren't prepared. Let me call for help." As Frank went to make the call, I took in my surroundings. The tiny store was cluttered but clean, stocked with basic supplies. Faded posters and old license plates decorated the walls. It felt like stepping back in time. Frank returned, saying an ambulance was on the way. He pulled up a chair across from me. "Mind if I keep you company while we wait? Don't get many visitors out here." I nodded gratefully, and we fell into conversation. Frank had run this remote gas station for over 40 years. He'd seen all sorts of people come through: tourists, truckers, drifters, and he'd helped his fair share of stranded travelers like me. "The desert doesn't forgive mistakes," he said, "but it also has a way of bringing out the best in people. Folks out here look out for each other." As we talked, I began to feel more like myself. The cool air and water had revived me, though I still felt weak and shaky. Frank kept a close eye on me. making sure I didn't drink too much too fast. After about an hour, we heard the wail of sirens in the distance. Soon, an ambulance pulled up outside. 2 paramedics rushed in and began checking me over. They confirmed I was suffering from severe dehydration and heat exhaustion. As they prepared to take me to the hospital, I turned to Frank. "I can't thank you enough," I said. "You saved my life." He waved off my thanks. "Just doing what anyone would do. You take care now, and remember, respect the desert. It's beautiful, but it can be deadly." The ride to the hospital was a blur. I drifted in and out of consciousness as the paramedics worked on me. At the ER, I was given IV fluids and monitored closely. The doctors told me I was extremely lucky. If I had been out there much longer, I might not have made it. As I lay in the hospital bed that night, I couldn't stop thinking about my ordeal. The vast, empty desert, the punishing heat, the desperation and fear as I pushed my body to its limits. And then the miraculous appearance of that lonely gas station, my oasis of salvation. I realized how close I had come to becoming another tragic statistic, another unprepared traveler claimed by the harsh desert environment. The experience had given me a newfound respect for the power of nature and the importance of proper preparation. But it had also shown me the incredible resilience of the human spirit. When pushed to the brink, I had found reserves of strength I didn't know I possessed, and I had experienced firsthand the compassion of strangers like Frank, whose simple act of kindness had saved my life. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for my survival, for the beauty of the desert, and for the reminder of our shared humanity in even the most isolated places. The next day, I was released from the hospital with strict instructions to rest and stay hydrated. My car had been towed to a local garage, and after getting it fixed up and filled with gas, I was ready to continue my journey. Before leaving town, I made one last stop at Frank's gas station. I wanted to thank him properly and say goodbye. As I pulled up, I saw him outside, adjusting one of the old pumps. He looked up as I got out of the car, a smile crinkling his weathered face. "Well, look who it is. Good to see you up and about, son." We chatted for a while, and I tried once again to express my gratitude. Frank just shook his head. "Like I said, it's what anyone would do, but I'm glad you're okay." As I turned to leave, Frank called out, "Remember what I told you. Respect the desert. It's got lessons to teach if you're willing to listen." I nodded, those words etching themselves into my memory. As I drove away, watching the little gas station recede in my rearview mirror, I felt changed by my experience. The desert had indeed taught me valuable lessons about preparation, resilience, and the unexpected kindness of strangers. My brush with disaster had given me a new perspective on life and a deeper appreciation for the harsh beauty of the natural world. As I continued my journey, I carried with me the memory of that harrowing day, a reminder of both the fragility and the strength of the human spirit in the face of nature's awesome power. At first, I didn't think much of it, but after a few turns, I realized it was following my every move. My heart started racing as I tried to convince myself I was just being paranoid. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I decided to test it by making a series of random turns. Sure enough, the SUV stayed right on my tail. Now I was really starting to freak out. Who were these people? What did they want with me? I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my palms sweating. Should I try to lose them? Go to the police station? Call 911? My mind was spinning. Suddenly, the SUV accelerated and rammed into my back bumper. The impact jolted me forward and I let out a terrified scream. This was really happening. Adrenaline surging, I slammed on the gas. My tires screeched as I took off down the empty street. The SUV was right behind me, engine roaring. I weaved through the streets frantically, taking sharp turns and blowing through red lights. But I couldn't shake them. Every time I thought I'd lost them, they'd appear in my rearview mirror again. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely control the car. Tears streamed down my face as I pleaded out loud, "Please, just leave me alone." I had no idea where I was going. I just knew I had to keep moving. At one point, I sideswiped a parked car, my side mirror flying off. But I didn't stop. The SUV was getting more aggressive, repeatedly ramming my bumper. I was terrified they were going to run me off the road. In desperation, I cut down a narrow alley, praying the SUV was too big to follow. But somehow they squeezed through, scraping the sides of the buildings. As I burst out of the alley, I saw a chance. There was a multi-level parking garage up ahead. I whipped into the entrance, tires squealing. I raced up the levels, the SUV in hot pursuit. On the top level, I pulled a risky move. I whipped around in a tight circle and flew back down the opposite ramp. For a moment, I thought I'd lost them. But then I heard the screech of tires as they turned to follow. Back on the street, I was running out of ideas. My car was beat up, smoking from the engine. I didn't know how much longer it would hold up. That's when I saw the flashing lights in my mirror. At first I panicked, thinking it was another threat. But then I realized it was the police. Someone must have called in the crazy chase. Relief flooded through me. I immediately pulled over, the SUV screeching to a halt behind me. Several police cars surrounded us, officers leaping out with guns drawn. They ordered the men in the SUV out with their hands up. I sat there shaking, unable to believe it was finally over. An officer came to check on me and I burst into tears, the fear and adrenaline finally overwhelming me. It turned out the men in the SUV were part of a local gang. They'd been following people home from bars and robbing them. I'd just been their random target that night. I gave my statement to the police, still trembling. They praised me for my quick thinking and driving skills. But honestly, I felt like I'd just been lucky. As I waited for a tow truck for my battered car, I couldn't stop replaying the chase in my mind. The sheer terror of being hunted through the city streets. The overwhelming relief when the police showed up. It took me a long time to feel safe driving at night again after that. I'd find myself constantly checking my mirrors, my heart racing whenever a car followed me for too long. But I also felt a new appreciation for the police and the crucial role they play. If they hadn't shown up when they did, who knows what would have happened to me. That night changed me. It made me more aware of my surroundings, more cautious, but it also showed me how strong I could be when pushed to my limits. I'll never forget the feeling of being pursued through those dark city streets. The panic, the desperation, the flood of relief when it was finally over. It was the most terrifying night of my life, but I survived. And for that, I'll always be grateful. I was a delivery driver for a small courier company, mainly handling packages for rural areas that the big shipping companies didn't bother with. It was a decent gig. The pay wasn't amazing, but I enjoyed the solitude of driving the back roads and seeing parts of the country most people never visit. One day in late October, I had a delivery scheduled for a tiny town I'd never been to before, way out in the sticks. As I drove further from civilization, the forests grew thicker and darker around the winding road. The GPS signal kept cutting in and out, but I managed to stay on track. After about an hour of driving, I came to a wooden sign that read, "Welcome to Millbrook, population 83. The paint was faded and peeling, and thick vines had grown over parts of it. I slowed down as I entered the town limits, looking around curiously. The place seemed completely deserted. Old buildings lined the main street, their windows dark and empty. Weeds grew up through cracks in the sidewalks. An American flag hung limply from a flagpole, tattered and faded almost white. The whole scene had an eerie, frozen-in-time quality. I pulled up in front of the address I was supposed to deliver to, a small general store with a faded Coca-Cola sign out front. The package was for Tom's General Store, but the dusty windows were dark and a heavy padlock secured the front door. An uneasy feeling settled in my stomach as I looked up and down the silent street. Where was everyone? Even the smallest towns usually had some signs of life, a barking dog, laundry on a line, smoke from a chimney. But there was nothing. I decided to see if I could find anyone to sign for the package. I got out of my van, the sound of the door closing echoing unnaturally loud in the silence. A chilly breeze rustled some dead leaves across the cracked pavement. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and swallowed up by the emptiness. No response. I walked down the sidewalk, peering into shop windows. A barber shop, its red and white pole hanging crookedly. A small diner with menus still visible on the tables. A hardware store, ancient tools rusting in the display. All empty. As I passed an alley between two buildings, movement caught my eye. I turned sharply, heart racing, but saw nothing in the shadowy space between the brick walls. Just my imagination, I told myself. I continued down the street, becoming more uneasy with each step. The back of my neck prickled, like I was being watched. I spun around suddenly, but the street behind me was just as empty as before. At the end of the main street was a small park with a rusted playground. As I approached, I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. There were fresh tire tracks in the gravel, cutting through the overgrown grass. Someone had been here recently. I was debating whether to continue exploring or head back to my van when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of a screen door creaking open and slamming shut. It came from a house across from the park. "Hello," I called out again, louder this time. "I'm looking for someone to sign for a delivery." For a long moment, there was no response. Then I heard heavy footsteps on a wooden porch. A figure emerged from the shadows of the house's front porch. It was a man, tall and gaunt. He wore dirty overalls and a flannel shirt that hung loosely on his thin frame. But it was his face that made my blood run cold. His skin was sallow and sunken, like a corpse. And his eyes, they were pitch black, no whites visible at all. They seemed to draw in the light around them. He stared at me silently, head cocked slightly to one side. A small smile played at the corners of his mouth, but there was no warmth in it. I took an instinctive step back. I have a delivery," I stammered. "For Tom's General Store. Do you know where I can find the owner?" The man's grin widened, revealing yellowed teeth. When he spoke, his voice was a dry rasp, like dead leaves scraping together. "Tom's been gone a long time, stranger. We all have." A chill ran down my spine. I tried to keep my voice steady. "What do you mean? What happened here?" He took a step off the porch, moving with an unnatural fluidity. "This town died years ago, but some of us, we linger, waiting." "Waiting for what?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. His black eyes seemed to bore into me. "For visitors, like you." He lunged forward with shocking speed. I barely had time to react, stumbling backwards and nearly falling. His hand brushed my arm and I felt a searing pain, like his touch was burning my skin. I turned and ran, heart pounding. Behind me, I heard an inhuman shriek of rage. I sprinted down the street towards my van, not daring to look back. As I ran, I became aware of movement in my peripheral vision. Shadows seemed to detach themselves from the buildings, flowing towards me like liquid darkness. The air grew thick and cold, making it hard to breathe. I reached my van, fumbling with shaking hands to get the key in the lock. Just as I wrenched the door open, a hand grabbed my shoulder. I cried out in pain and fear, feeling that burning sensation again. I threw myself into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut. The man's face appeared in the window, those black eyes inches from mine. His mouth opened impossibly wide, revealing row after row of pointed teeth. I jammed the key in the ignition, and the engine roared to life. I threw the van into reverse and stomped on the gas. The tires squealed as I backed up rapidly, the man's form growing smaller in my windshield. I spun the wheel, shifting into drive. As I sped away, I glimpsed dozens of dark figures emerging from the buildings, flowing into the street behind me. Their unearthly shrieks followed me as I floored it out of town. I didn't slow down until I was miles away, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. My shoulder throbbed where the man had grabbed me. When I got home that night, I found a perfect handprint seared into my skin, the flesh red and blistered. I quit my job the next day. I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone what had really happened. Who would believe me? I searched online for information about Millbrook, but found nothing. According to official records, the town had been abandoned in the 1950s after the local mine closed. But I know what I saw. Sometimes I still dream about those black eyes and those shadowy figures pursuing me. And I wonder, what would have happened if I hadn't escaped? What were they waiting for in that dead town? I don't make deliveries to rural areas anymore, and I always triple-check my GPS before driving anywhere unfamiliar, because you never know what might be waiting for you in those forgotten places, hungry for a visitor to break the endless silence. As I pulled up to the address, I saw a lone figure standing in the shadows near an abandoned warehouse. A chill ran down my spine, but I reminded myself I'd done hundreds of late-night pickups before without incident. The passenger climbed into the back seat, and I got my first good look at him in the rearview mirror. He was a middle-aged man with graying hair and pale, gaunt features. His eyes had a strange, glassy look to them that immediately put me on edge. "Where to?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just drive north," he replied in a raspy whisper. "I'll tell you when to stop." Every instinct told me to refuse and kick this guy out of my cab, but something in his tone made me hesitate. There was an undercurrent of desperation, almost pleading, beneath the quiet command. Against my better judgment, I put the car in drive and headed north out of the city. We drove in tense silence for nearly an hour, the urban sprawl giving way to dark country roads. My passenger sat motionless in the back, staring vacantly out the window. I kept glancing in the mirror, half expecting him to lunge at me at any moment, but he remained still as a statue. Finally, he spoke again. "Pull over here." We were on a deserted stretch of road, nothing but dense forest on either side. No houses or buildings in sight, just pitch blackness beyond the reach of my headlights. "Are you sure this is where you want to stop?" I asked nervously. "There's nothing out here." "This is the place," he insisted. "How much do I owe you?" I named an amount, and to my surprise, he pulled out a wad of cash, handing me several times what the fare should have been. Before I could say anything, he was out of the car and walking swiftly into the woods. I sat there for a long moment, heart pounding. What the hell had just happened? Should I call the police? As I debated what to do, I suddenly noticed headlights approaching in my rearview mirror. Relief washed over me as I saw it was a police cruiser. The officer pulled up behind me and got out, approaching my window. "Everything all right here?" he asked, shining his flashlight into the cab. I started to explain the situation, telling him about the strange passenger I'd just dropped off in the middle of nowhere. But as I spoke, I noticed the officer's expression changing. His eyes narrowed, and his hand drifted to rest on his holstered gun. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle," he said in a cold, hard voice. Confused and frightened, I complied. As soon as I was out of the car, the officer roughly spun me around and slammed me against the hood, cuffing my hands behind my back. "What's going on?" I cried out. "I didn't do anything wrong." The officer ignored my protests as he patted me down. "We've been looking for you," he growled. "Where's the girl?" "What girl?" I asked, genuinely baffled. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play dumb with me," he snarled. "We know you picked her up. Where did you take her?" My mind was reeling. This had to be some kind of mistake or misunderstanding. I tried to explain again about the strange man I'd dropped off, but the officer clearly wasn't buying it. He roughly shoved me into the back of his cruiser and started searching my taxi. After a few minutes, he came back looking frustrated and angry. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing," he said, "but we're going to get to the bottom of this back at the station." As we drove away, leaving my cab abandoned by the roadside, I stared out the window in shock. The woods seemed to press in oppressively on both sides of the road. For a moment, I thought I saw a pale face watching us from between the trees, my mysterious passenger. But when I blinked, it was gone. The next several hours were a nightmare of confusion and fear. I was fingerprinted, photographed, and interrogated for hours about a missing girl I knew nothing about. No matter how many times I told my story, the police clearly thought I was lying or delusional. It wasn't until nearly dawn that things finally started to clear up. Another officer burst into the interrogation room looking shaken. "We found her," he said, "alive. She was wandering along the highway about 10 miles from where we picked this guy up. Says she escaped from some cabin in the woods." The interrogating officer's demeanor instantly changed. He uncuffed me and started apologizing profusely, explaining there had been a string of abductions in the area and they'd been desperately searching for the latest victim. When they got a report of a taxi dropping someone off in the woods, they'd assumed the worst. I was too exhausted and shell-shocked to feel much relief. They offered to drive me back to my cab, but I couldn't face getting behind the wheel again so soon. I called a friend to pick me up instead. As I waited outside the police station, I noticed a familiar face on a missing persons flyer tacked to a community bulletin board. It was my passenger from the night before. According to the poster, he'd disappeared over a week ago while hiking in the woods. I pointed it out to a passing officer, my hands shaking. He frowned as he examined it. "That's impossible," he said. "This man was found dead 3 days ago. Looks like he got lost in the woods and succumbed to exposure." I felt the blood drain from my face as I stared at the photo. There was no doubt. It was the same man who'd been in my cab just hours earlier. But how could that be? The officer must have seen my distress because his tone softened. "Look, you've been through a lot tonight. Stress and fatigue can play tricks on your mind. Why don't you go home and get some rest?" I nodded numbly and wandered away. But I knew what I'd seen. That man, or whatever he was, had been in my taxi. I'd felt the weight of the cash he handed me. I'd heard his voice and seen his face reflected in my mirror. In the weeks since that night, I've tried to make sense of what happened. Was it all some kind of elaborate hoax, a case of mistaken identity, or something more inexplicable? I've gone back to driving my regular shifts, but I can't shake the lingering unease. Every time I pick up a fare, I find myself studying their reflection, half expecting to see that pale, otherworldly face staring back at me. And on dark, lonely stretches of road, I sometimes think I catch glimpses of a solitary figure standing in the shadows, waiting. I don't know if I'll ever understand what really occurred that night. But one thing's for certain. I'll never look at late-night fares the same way again. There are strange things that happen in the darkness, beyond the reach of our headlights. And sometimes, the real mystery isn't where our passengers are going, but where they've come from. As I drove further from town, the roads got narrower and more isolated. Fields of corn stretched out on either side, rustling gently in the night breeze. The address I was given took me down a long dirt road surrounded by dense woods. My headlights illuminated an old, run-down farmhouse at the end of the drive. Something felt off as I pulled up. The house was completely dark, no porch light on, or any signs of activity inside. Normally, when we respond to calls, especially late at night, people are waiting outside to flag us down, but there was no one here. I radioed dispatch to confirm the address and grabbed my gear. As I approached the front door, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Years of experience had honed my instincts, and every alarm bell was ringing. But I had a job to do. If there really was someone in cardiac distress inside, every second counted. I knocked loudly and announced myself as a paramedic. No response. I tried the door and found it unlocked. Stepping inside, I called out again. The house was pitch black and eerily silent. I fumbled for my flashlight and swept the beam around what looked like an abandoned living room. Sheets covered the furniture, and a thick layer of dust coated every surface. Suddenly, I heard a creak from upstairs. "Hello, this is paramedic services. Is anyone up there?" I called out. No answer, but another creak. My heart was pounding as I made my way up the rickety stairs. At the top, I saw a faint light coming from under a closed door at the end of the hallway. As I approached, I heard muffled voices. Relief washed over me. There really was someone here who needed help. I knocked and opened the door. "Paramedic services, I'm here to..." The words died in my throat. The room was empty except for a laptop on a table, playing a looped audio file of people talking. As realization dawned on me, I heard heavy footsteps behind me. Before I could react, something hard cracked against the back of my skull. The world went black. I came to with a pounding headache, disoriented and nauseous. As my vision cleared, panic set in. I was tied to a chair in what looked like a basement or cellar. My arms were bound tightly behind me, ankles secured to the chair legs. A single bare bulb cast harsh shadows around the dank space. Two men stood a few feet away, talking in low voices. One was huge, at least 6'5", and built like a linebacker. The other was shorter but wiry, with a mean rat-like face. They turned as I stirred. "Well, look who's finally awake," Ratface sneered. "Thought we might have hit you too hard there, Doc." What do you want?" I croaked, my mouth dry as sandpaper. The big guy stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. "What we want is that fancy ambulance of yours. Gonna strip it for parts, maybe use it for some jobs of our own. But first," he grinned, revealing several missing teeth. "First we're gonna have some fun." Over the next few hours, they took turns working me over. Punches, kicks, burning cigarettes on my arms. I lost track of time, drifting in and out of consciousness. They kept asking about access codes to the ambulance's drug lockbox, but I refused to give them up. As the beating continued, my mind raced, desperately searching for a way out. I knew if I didn't escape soon, I probably wouldn't make it out of here alive. These guys weren't just thieves, they were sadists who seemed to be enjoying themselves way too much. During a lull in the assault, I noticed Ratface pull out a syringe. My blood ran cold as I realized what was coming next. As a paramedic, I'd seen the devastating effects of overdoses far too often. If they injected me with something, it was game over. Adrenaline surged through me. It was now or never. As Ratface approached with the needle, I summoned every ounce of strength I had left. I threw my weight backwards, tipping the chair over. The impact was jarring, but I felt the worn wood splinter beneath me. Chaos erupted. The big guy lunged for me as I frantically worked to free myself from the broken chair. My hands came loose just as he reached me. I grabbed a splintered chair leg and swung with all my might, catching him in the knee. He howled in pain and stumbled. Ratface came at me next, but the syringe had fallen in the commotion. We grappled on the ground, trading blows. He was quicker than me, but desperation lent me strength. I managed to get on top of him, raining down punches until he stopped moving. The big guy was back on his feet now, limping towards me with murder in his eyes. I scrambled away, searching for a weapon, an exit, anything. My hand closed around something heavy, a rusty pipe. I swung it just as he reached for me, connecting solidly with his temple. He dropped like a stone. Heart racing, I staggered to my feet. Every part of me ached, but I pushed through the pain. I had to get out of here before they came to. The cellar door was locked, but I found a small window near the ceiling. It was a tight squeeze, but fueled by desperation, I managed to wriggle through. I emerged into the pre-dawn gloom, gulping in the cool air. The farmhouse loomed behind me as I limped towards the road as fast as I could manage. I had no idea where my ambulance was or how far I'd have to go to find help. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, I heard the blessed sound of an approaching vehicle. An old pickup truck came into view, and I waved my arms frantically. The driver, an elderly man, pulled over with a concerned look. "Good Lord, son, what happened to you?" he exclaimed as I collapsed against the side of his truck. "Please," I gasped, "I need to get to the police. There are dangerous men back there. They might be coming after me." He helped me into the passenger seat and sped off towards town. As we drove, I filled him in on what had happened. He radioed ahead on his CB, and soon we were met by a convoy of police cars and another ambulance. The next few days passed in a blur of hospital stays, police interviews, and fitful sleep plagued by nightmares. They caught the 2 men who attacked me, along with several accomplices. Turns out they were part of a ring that had been targeting emergency vehicles across 3 states. It's been months now, and I'm still dealing with the physical and emotional fallout from that night. But I'm back at work, doing the job I love. Every time I respond to a call, especially in remote areas, that fear creeps back in. But I refuse to let it control me. Those men tried to break me, to corrupt the oath I took to help others. In the end, they failed. I'm still here, still answering the call, still saving lives. And that's a victory they can never take away from me. It all started when I came across an obscure online forum post about a supposedly haunted highway that had been closed to traffic for decades. The post was vague on details, but mentioned strange sightings and unexplained phenomena reported by the few brave souls who had dared to explore it. My curiosity was instantly piqued. I've always been a bit of a skeptic when it comes to the paranormal, so I figured it would make for an interesting day trip if nothing else. After some digging, I managed to pinpoint the location, an old stretch of Route 61 in rural Pennsylvania that had been abandoned due to subsidence from underground mine fires. It took me about 3 hours to drive there from my home in Pittsburgh. The whole way I kept telling myself this was probably just going to be a bust. Maybe I'd see some cool abandoned structures, but certainly nothing supernatural. I arrived at the turnoff for the old highway around 2 p.m. on a gloomy, overcast day. There was a rusty gate blocking vehicle access, with faded no trespassing signs hanging from it. I parked my car on the shoulder and climbed over the gate on foot. Looking down the desolate stretch of cracked asphalt disappearing into the mist, I felt a chill run down my spine. But I brushed it off as just pre-adventure jitters and started walking. The first mile or so was actually kind of peaceful. The silence was eerie but not menacing. I snapped some photos of the overgrown roadside and dilapidated buildings. But as I ventured deeper, things started to feel off. The air grew thick and oppressive, like some unseen force was pressing down on me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I had the distinct feeling of being watched, even though I couldn't see anyone else around. I tried to rationalize it, probably just my imagination running wild in this spooky setting. But then I heard it, a low, guttural moan that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I froze in my tracks, heart pounding. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No response, just that same haunting moan fading away. I seriously considered turning back right then and there, but my stubborn curiosity won out. I pressed on, though my pace quickened considerably. The further I went, the more unsettling things became. Strange whispers seemed to follow me, always just on the edge of intelligibility. Shadows darted in my peripheral vision, vanishing when I turned to look. About 2 miles in, I came across an old gas station. Its weathered sign creaked ominously in the wind. As I approached to take a closer look, movement caught my eye in one of the grimy windows. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. Suddenly, a pale face pressed against the glass, eyes wide and mouth gaping in a silent scream. I stumbled backwards with a yelp. When I looked again, the face was gone. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone to check the time. To my shock, it was already past 5 p.m. How had 3 hours passed so quickly? The sky was growing dark, and a heavy fog was rolling in. I knew I needed to get out of there fast. I turned to retrace my steps, but nothing looked familiar anymore. The fog was so thick I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. Panic started to set in as I realized I was lost. I picked a direction and started walking briskly, desperately hoping I was heading back towards my car. That's when the footsteps started. At first they were faint, just a soft shuffling behind me. But they grew louder, closer. I walked faster. The footsteps sped up too. Soon I was running full tilt down the broken highway, the sound of pursuit right on my heels. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. A dark, misshapen figure was lurching after me, moving with unnatural speed. Its form seemed to shimmer and distort like it wasn't fully solid. I let out a terrified scream and ran harder than I've ever run in my life. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like jelly, but sheer adrenaline kept me going. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I spotted a familiar landmark through the fog, the rusty gate where I'd entered. With a final burst of desperate energy, I sprinted towards it. I practically dove over the gate, scraping my arms on the metal but barely feeling it. I fumbled for my car keys with trembling hands and somehow managed to get the door open. As I peeled away from the shoulder, tires squealing, I caught one last glimpse in my rearview mirror of a mass of shadowy figures gathered at the gate, watching me go. I didn't stop driving until I was safely back in Pittsburgh city limits. It took days for my racing heart to calm down. Even now, weeks later, I still wake up in a cold sweat some nights, haunted by vivid nightmares of what I experienced on that godforsaken highway. I've tried researching the history of that stretch of road since then, looking for any explanation of what I encountered. But information is scarce, and the few accounts I've found from other explorers are vague and contradictory. Part of me still wants to go back, to prove to myself that it was all just an illusion brought on by an overactive imagination. But a much larger part knows that what I experienced was all too real. So consider this a warning to any fellow adventure seekers out there. Some places are abandoned and forgotten for a reason. That highway may look tempting to explore, but trust me, whatever lingers there is best left undisturbed. I count myself lucky to have escaped with my sanity intact. Others may not be so fortunate. I still can't shake the feeling that a piece of me was left behind on that road. Like those entities latched onto some part of my soul and followed me home. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I catch glimpses of shadowy figures. And on quiet nights, I swear I can still hear those unearthly moans carried on the wind. Will I ever truly be free of that place? I don't know. But I do know this. You couldn't pay me all the money in the world to set foot on that highway again. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. To keep myself alert, I flipped on the CB radio, listening to the chatter of other drivers to pass the time. Mostly it was just the usual stuff, warnings about speed traps, weather updates, that kind of thing. But then a call came through that made me sit up straight. Mayday, Mayday, any drivers near mile marker 283, I need assistance ASAP, please respond. The voice was panicked, crackling with static. I glanced at my odometer. I was only about 10 miles from that marker. Without hesitation, I keyed the mic. This is Big Red. I copy your Mayday. What's your situation, good buddy? There was no response, just dead air. I tried again. Driver requesting assistance. Do you copy? What's your 20? Still nothing. A chill ran down my spine. In all my years on the road, I'd never heard a call like that go unanswered. Something was wrong. I debated what to do for a split second, but I knew I couldn't just drive on by. If someone needed help, I had to at least check it out. So I kept my eyes peeled as I approached mile marker 283. At first I didn't see anything out of the ordinary, just more empty desert and highway stretching into the distance. But then I spotted it. A truck pulled over on the shoulder about a quarter mile ahead, no lights on. As I got closer, I could see it was an older model Peterbilt, similar to mine. The cab was dark, no movement that I could see. I slowed down and pulled over about 50 yards behind it, leaving my engine idling and headlights on. "Hello?" I called out as I climbed down from my cab. "Anyone there? I heard your call for help." The only response was the whisper of the wind across the empty landscape. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something felt very, very wrong. I approached cautiously, one hand on the maglite in my pocket. As I got closer to the Peterbilt, I noticed the driver's side door was slightly ajar. "Hey, buddy, you all right in there?" I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. That's when I saw it. A dark stain on the ground below the open door, glistening wetly in the beam of my flashlight. My stomach dropped as I realized what I was looking at. A pool of blood. I yanked open the door, heart pounding. The cab was empty, but there were more bloodstains on the seat and floor, and there, wedged between the seats, was a CB radio handset, cord severed. Jesus Christ, I muttered, stumbling backwards. What the hell happened here? That's when I heard it, a soft thump from the back of the truck. I froze, hardly daring to breathe. It came again, louder this time. Something was in the trailer. Every instinct screamed at me to run back to my truck and get the hell out of there. But I couldn't leave, not without knowing what happened to the driver. So with trembling hands, I made my way to the rear of the trailer. The padlock on the doors had been cut. Taking a deep breath, I yanked one door open, shining my flashlight inside. The beam illuminated a horrific scene. The trailer was mostly empty, except for a crumpled form lying in a pool of blood near the front. It was a man, the driver, I assumed. He wasn't moving. I climbed inside, my legs threatening to give out as I approached the body. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Drag marks in the blood, leading from the cab to where the man now lay. He had been alive when he made that Mayday call. Someone, or something, had attacked him in the cab, then dragged him back here to finish the job. I knelt down beside the body, hand shaking as I reached out to check for a pulse. But before I could touch him, his eyes snapped open. I recoiled in shock, scrambling backwards. The man's mouth worked silently for a moment before he managed to rasp out a single word: "Run!" A scraping sound came from the front of the trailer. I whirled around, heart pounding, to see a dark shape detach itself from the shadows. It moved with a fluid, inhuman grace as it stalked towards me. In the dim light, I caught glimpses of pale, mottled skin and long, razor-sharp claws. I didn't wait to see more. I bolted for the open door, practically falling out of the trailer in my desperation to escape. Behind me, I heard an inhuman shriek of rage. I sprinted for my truck, lungs burning. I could hear it right behind me, so close I could feel its hot breath on my neck. With a final burst of speed, I hurled myself into the cab and slammed the door. Claws scrabbled at the window as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life and I floored it, tires squealing as I pulled away. In the rearview mirror, I caught a final glimpse of a pale, twisted face contorted in fury before it vanished into the night. I drove for hours, pedal to the floor, too terrified to stop. When the sun finally rose, I pulled into the first truck stop I saw and collapsed, shaking in my bunk. I never reported what I saw that night. Who would believe me? Sometimes I managed to convince myself it was just a hallucination brought on by too many hours on the road. But in my heart, I know the truth. There's something out there in the desert, something that hunts lone truckers on dark highways. I've never driven that stretch of I-40 again. These days, I stick to short local routes in populated areas. But I still keep my doors locked at night, and I never, ever answer distress calls on the CB anymore. To this day, I wonder about that driver. Did he survive? Was he the first victim, or just the latest in a long line? I'll never know. All I know is that I came face to face with true evil that night, and I'll carry that terror with me for the rest of my life. So if you're ever driving through the Southwest late at night and you hear a call for help on the CB, just keep on driving. Don't stop. Don't look back, because you never know what might be waiting for you in the darkness. The first few hours of the hike were exactly what I had hoped for. The air was cool and invigorating, and the fall colors painted the landscape in vibrant hues of red, orange, and gold. I felt alive and at peace, relishing the solitude and natural beauty surrounding me. However, as the day wore on, things began to take a turn for the worse. The trail became increasingly difficult to navigate, with overgrown sections and unclear markers. I found myself constantly checking my map and compass, but the terrain didn't seem to match up with what I was seeing. A sense of unease began to creep over me as I realized I might be lost. As the afternoon progressed, the weather suddenly changed. Dark clouds rolled in, and a cold wind picked up, chilling me to the bone. I knew I needed to find shelter soon, but I was miles from any designated campsite or ranger station. Panic started to set in as I considered the possibility of being stranded overnight in the wilderness. Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, I stumbled upon a small clearing. To my immense relief, I spotted a rustic cabin nestled among the trees. It looked old and weathered, but it was my best hope for shelter from the impending storm. I approached cautiously, my instincts telling me something wasn't quite right, but my desperation overrode any hesitation. As I neared the cabin, I noticed there were no signs of recent activity. The windows were dark, and leaves had piled up around the entrance. I called out, hoping someone might be inside, but my voice was met with silence. With no other options, I decided to try the door. To my surprise, it wasn't locked. The hinges creaked ominously as I pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit interior. The cabin was sparsely furnished, with a few pieces of old, worn furniture and a stone fireplace dominating one wall. A thick layer of dust covered everything, suggesting it had been abandoned for some time. Despite the cabin's run-down appearance, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. At least I had a roof over my head and walls to protect me from the elements. I set my backpack down and began to explore the space, hoping to find some supplies or a way to start a fire. As I moved deeper into the cabin, a chill ran down my spine. Something felt off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The air seemed heavy, almost oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was just nerves from being lost and alone in an unfamiliar place. I was rummaging through some cabinets in the small kitchen area when I heard it, a faint creak coming from somewhere behind me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I turned around, half expecting to see nothing but shadows. What I saw instead made my blood run cold. A figure stood in the doorway of what I assumed was a bedroom. It was tall and gaunt, barely illuminated by the fading light coming through the windows. I couldn't make out any features, but I could feel its eyes boring into me. For a moment, neither of us moved, locked in a terrifying standoff. Then, without warning, the figure lunged towards me with inhuman speed. I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair in my panic. The crash seemed to echo through the cabin as I scrambled to put distance between myself and the advancing threat. As it came into the light, I got a better look at my attacker. It was a man, or at least it had once been a man. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his bones, his eyes sunken and wild. He wore tattered clothes that hung loosely on his emaciated frame. But what struck me most was the look of feral hunger in his eyes. I had no time to process what I was seeing. Pure survival instinct took over as I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy iron skillet from the stove, and swung it with all my might. The pan connected with a sickening thud, and the creature stumbled back, momentarily stunned. Taking advantage of the brief reprieve, I bolted for the door. My fingers fumbled with the handle, precious seconds ticking by as I struggled to open it. Just as I managed to yank it open, I felt a hand grasp my shoulder, its grip inhumanly strong. I spun around, using my momentum to break free, and found myself face to face with my attacker. His mouth was open in a silent snarl, revealing rows of yellowed, sharp teeth. The sight was so shocking that I nearly froze again, but the sound of fabric tearing as his nails dug into my jacket snapped me back to reality. With a desperate burst of strength, I shoved him back and darted out of the cabin. The storm had picked up, rain now pelting down in icy sheets. I ran blindly into the forest, branches whipping at my face and roots threatening to trip me at every step. Behind me, I could hear the creature in pursuit, crashing through the underbrush with terrifying speed. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but fear drove me onward. I had no idea where I was going. My only thought was to put as much distance between myself and that nightmarish cabin as possible. The darkness of the forest closed in around me, shadows seeming to reach out with grasping fingers. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning as I pushed myself beyond what I thought possible. Eventually, I realized I could no longer hear my pursuer. I slowed to a stop, gasping for air and straining my ears for any sign of danger. The forest was quiet except for the sound of rain and my own ragged breathing. I leaned against a tree, trying to gather my wits and figure out what to do next. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the full weight of what had happened hit me. I slid down to the ground, my body shaking uncontrollably. I must have sat there for hours, too terrified to move, jumping at every sound. As dawn began to break, casting a gray light through the trees, I finally found the courage to start moving again. I picked a direction and walked, hoping to find my way back to civilization. By some miracle, I stumbled onto a hiking trail later that morning. It led me to a ranger station, where I collapsed, exhausted and traumatized. The rangers were alarmed by my appearance and the wild story I told them. They organized a search party to investigate the cabin, but when they reached the location I described, they found nothing but an old foundation overgrown with vegetation. To this day, I can't explain what happened to me in those mountains. The authorities suggested I might have been delirious from exhaustion and exposure, but I know what I saw and experienced was real. Sometimes, in my darkest moments, I can still feel those cold, bony fingers grasping at me, still see those hungry eyes gleaming in the darkness. I've never gone hiking alone again, and I avoid remote areas at all costs. The encounter in that mountain cabin changed me forever, leaving me with a deep-seated fear of the unknown that lurks in isolated places. Whatever was in that cabin, it wasn't human, and I thank my lucky stars every day that I managed to escape. But a part of me wonders if it's still out there, waiting for another unsuspecting traveler to stumble upon its lair. As I approached the wreck cautiously, my flashlight beam revealed no one inside or nearby. The car looked like it had been there for hours, not minutes. An uneasy feeling crept over me. Why would someone report a fresh accident here? Suddenly, I heard footsteps crunching on gravel behind me. I spun around to see 3 large men emerging from the shadows, wearing dark clothes and ski masks. My heart started racing as I realized we'd walked right into some kind of trap. "Where's the injured person?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. One of the men chuckled darkly. "Oh, there's about to be an injured person, all right." I turned to run back to the ambulance, but 2 more masked figures stepped out from behind it, blocking our escape. Tom was frozen in fear beside me as the men closed in. "Listen, guys, we don't want any trouble," I said, holding my hands up. "Just take what you want and let us go." "Oh, we will," the apparent leader sneered. "But first we're going to have some fun." My mind raced, searching for a way out of this nightmare. There were too many of them to fight. The ambulance was blocked. We were miles from help with no cell service. As the men got closer, I noticed one of them carrying rope. With a sickening jolt, I realized they weren't planning to just rob us. They intended much worse. A primal survival instinct kicked in, and I knew I had to act fast. In one fluid motion, I yanked the heavy metal flashlight from my belt and swung it as hard as I could at the nearest attacker's head. There was a sickening crack as it connected, and he crumpled to the ground. "Run!" I screamed at Tom, shoving him towards a gap between two of the men. We sprinted into the darkness as angry shouts and pounding footsteps followed close behind. My lungs burned as we tore through the scrubby underbrush lining the highway. Branches whipped at my face and thorns tore at my uniform, but I didn't slow down. I could hear our pursuers gaining on us. They knew this area better than we did. Terror lent me an extra burst of speed as I realized what would happen if they caught us. Up ahead, I spotted a steep embankment leading down to a ravine. It was risky in the dark, but it was our only chance to lose them. "This way," I gasped, grabbing Tom's arm and veering sharply off the road. We half ran, half slid down the loose dirt and rocks, using trees and bushes to slow our descent. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter above us. At the bottom, we splashed across a shallow creek and scrambled up the other side, finally collapsing in exhaustion behind a thick cluster of trees. For several long minutes, we lay there silently, straining to hear any signs of our attackers. But the woods were quiet, except for the pounding of my own heart and Tom's ragged breathing beside me. "What the hell was that?" Tom finally whispered. I shook my head, still trying to process what had just happened. "I don't know, but we need to keep moving. They could still be searching for us." We set off again at a slower pace, picking our way carefully through the pitch-black forest. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves made me flinch. I had no idea where we were or which direction would lead us back to civilization. After what felt like hours of aimless wandering, a faint glow appeared through the trees ahead. Heart leaping with hope, we quickened our pace. The trees thinned out, and we found ourselves on the edge of a small, run-down gas station. An ancient pickup truck was parked out front, engine idling. An older man stood next to it, filling up a gas can. He looked startled as we burst out of the woods, wild-eyed and covered in dirt and scratches. "Please, you have to help us," I said breathlessly. "We were attacked. Men in masks. They're after us." The man's eyes widened as he took in our disheveled appearance and obvious fear. Without a word, he gestured for us to get in his truck. We scrambled into the cab as he tossed the gas can in the bed and jumped in the driver's seat. As we sped away down the lonely country road, I finally allowed myself to relax slightly. We'd made it. We were safe. The man, who introduced himself as Earl, listened in stunned silence as we recounted our harrowing ordeal. He insisted on driving us straight to the sheriff's office in the next town over. The local police were skeptical at first, but a quick call to our ambulance dispatch confirmed we were legitimate paramedics who had gone missing on a call. Soon, the entire area was swarming with cops searching for our attackers. They never found the men who ambushed us that night. The overturned car was gone when police arrived at the scene, leaving no evidence of the elaborate trap. To this day, I have no idea who those men were or what their true intentions were. Were they some kind of organized crime ring, a cult, just sick individuals looking for victims? The experience left me shaken for months. I had nightmares about masked figures chasing me through dark woods. I jumped at every sound when working night shifts, but I refused to let the fear control me or force me to quit the job I loved. I'm much more cautious now when responding to remote locations, especially at night. I always make sure dispatch knows our exact location and we have a way to call for backup if needed. Sometimes I still think about how differently things could have ended if I hadn't reacted quickly or if we hadn't found that gas station. I'm grateful every day that I made it out alive and can continue helping others as a paramedic. But I'll never forget that terrifying night when a routine call turned into a desperate fight for survival. I was just a regular mechanic, minding my own business at the shop on what seemed like any other Tuesday. It was getting late, almost closing time, when I got a call on the emergency line. A woman's voice, panicked and breathless, begged for help. She said her car had broken down on some remote back road and she was stranded. Now, I'll be honest, I was hesitant to take the job. It was already dark out, and driving out to the middle of nowhere that late at night didn't exactly sound appealing. But the desperation in her voice got to me. What if it was my own mom or sister stuck out there alone? So against my better judgment, I agreed to come help. I jotted down the directions she gave me and headed out in my tow truck. The roads got narrower and more overgrown as I drove, civilization fading away behind me. After about 30 minutes of driving, I found myself on a dirt road winding through dense forest. No streetlights, no houses, nothing but trees as far as the eye could see. My headlights swept across something up ahead. An old beat-up sedan pulled off to the side of the road. But as I pulled up, I realized there was no one around. No sign of the woman who had called. Just an empty car sitting there in the darkness. A chill ran down my spine. Something felt very wrong about this whole situation. But I figured maybe she had wandered off looking for help or cell signal. So I got out to take a look at the car. As soon as I opened the hood, I knew this was no ordinary breakdown. The engine looked like it had been deliberately sabotaged. Wires cut, parts removed. This car hadn't just broken down by accident. Someone had done this on purpose. My heart started pounding. I slammed the hood shut and spun around, suddenly feeling like I was being watched from the darkness of the woods. That's when I noticed a faint light flickering through the trees, maybe a quarter-mile away. Every instinct told me to get the hell out of there. But a nagging voice in my head said I should at least check if the woman who called was over there and needed help. So, like an idiot, I grabbed my flashlight and started walking towards the light. As I got closer, I could make out the shape of a small wooden cabin. But something about it just looked wrong. The proportions were slightly off, the angles not quite right. Like it had been built by someone who had only vaguely heard of what a cabin should look like. I crept up to a grimy window and peered inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. The interior was a nightmarish scene. Bizarre symbols and diagrams covered every inch of the walls, floor, and ceiling. They looked like they had been painted in something dark and crusty that I prayed wasn't blood. In the center of the room was a crude altar made of mismatched pieces of wood. Atop it sat an assortment of knives, bones, and things I couldn't even identify. Candles flickered, casting wild shadows that seemed to writhe and move on their own. I stumbled back from the window, my mind reeling. This was so much worse than I could have imagined. I had to get out of here now. As I turned to run, my foot caught on something. I looked down and nearly screamed. Partially hidden in the undergrowth was a human skull, gleaming white in the moonlight. Pure terror took over. I sprinted back towards my truck as fast as my legs could carry me. Branches whipped at my face, but I barely felt them. All I could think about was getting away from that horrific cabin. I was almost back to the road when I heard it, a low, guttural chanting coming from behind me. The sound made my skin crawl. I didn't dare look back, just ran harder. Finally, I burst out of the tree line and saw my truck. I've never been so glad to see anything in my life. I practically dove into the cab, fumbling with shaking hands to get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life and I slammed it into drive, tires spinning in the dirt as I accelerated away. In my rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of multiple shadowy figures emerging from the woods. But I didn't slow down to get a better look. I drove like a maniac all the way back to town, convinced that at any moment those things would catch up to me. It wasn't until I was safely back in my own driveway that I finally allowed myself to breathe. For weeks afterwards, I was jumpy and paranoid. I kept expecting to see those creepy figures lurking around every corner. I thought about reporting what I'd seen to the police, but who would believe such an insane story? And what if those cultists or whatever they were found out and came after me? So I've kept it to myself all this time. But I still have nightmares about that cabin in the woods. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of that chanting echoing in my ears. I don't know what would have happened if I'd arrived at that cabin a little earlier, or if I'd gone inside. But I'm certain I narrowly escaped something truly evil that night. These days, I don't answer late-night calls from strangers anymore, and I never, ever drive out to secluded areas alone after dark. You never know what might be waiting for you in the shadows. Take it from me, some calls for help are better left unanswered. Jessica had dozed off in the passenger seat about an hour ago. I was starting to feel pretty drowsy myself, but I knew we were almost there. Just had to push through a little longer. The radio was playing softly, some late-night talk show discussing conspiracy theories. I wasn't really paying attention, just letting the voices fill the silence. Suddenly, I noticed headlights appear in my rearview mirror. They were pretty far back at first, but closing in fast. Within a minute or two, the car behind us was right on our tail, high beams blaring. I squinted against the glare, trying to focus on the road ahead. "What the hell?" I muttered. There was no one else around for miles. Why was this person riding my ass like this? I tapped the brakes, hoping they'd back off. Instead, the car swerved into the left lane and gunned it, roaring past us. As it did, I caught a glimpse of the passengers, two guys in creepy white masks staring right at me. A chill ran down my spine. The car cut in front of us sharply, nearly clipping our bumper. Then it slammed on the brakes. I cursed and swerved, barely avoiding rear-ending them. My heart was pounding as I tried to regain control. "What's going on?" Jessica had jolted awake from the commotion. Before I could answer, the car ahead of us came to a complete stop, blocking both lanes. I hit the brakes hard, skidding to a halt about 20 feet behind them. "Oh my God," Jessica whispered. The doors of the other car flew open and 4 men in white masks piled out. They were all carrying baseball bats or crowbars. My blood ran cold as they started walking towards us. "Lock the doors," I yelled, fumbling for my phone. But as I tried to dial 911, I realized in horror that I had no signal. We were completely cut off. Jessica was hyperventilating beside me. "What do we do? What do we do?" I threw the car into reverse, ready to floor it. But a quick glance in the rearview mirror showed another car had pulled up behind us, blocking our escape. More masked figures emerged. We were trapped. The men surrounded our car, leering at us through their expressionless masks. One of them, a huge guy with a bat, started tapping on my window. "Get out of the car," he growled. I hesitated, desperately trying to think of a way out of this nightmare. The man raised his bat and smashed it against the window. The glass spider-webbed but didn't shatter. "I said get out, now!" he roared. With shaking hands, I unlocked the doors. Jessica grabbed my arm. "Don't," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "We don't have a choice," I said. "Just stay calm. We'll get through this." We stepped out of the car, hands raised. The masked men circled us like sharks. I could hear Jessica whimpering beside me. "Wallets, phones, jewelry, everything," the leader demanded, brandishing his bat. "Now!" I slowly reached for my wallet and phone, handing them over. Jessica did the same, her hands trembling violently as she removed her wedding ring. "The watch, too," one of them said, pointing at my wrist. I unclasped it and held it out. As soon as the man grabbed it, another one shoved me hard. I stumbled and fell to the ground. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw them grab Jessica. "No!" I yelled, scrambling to my feet, but two of them held me back as I thrashed uselessly. "Please," Jessica sobbed as they pawed at her. "Please don't hurt us." The leader stepped forward, tilting his head as he studied us. "You two are lucky," he said. "We're feeling generous tonight." He nodded to the others, and they shoved us towards our car. "Get in and drive," he ordered. "Don't stop, don't look back. If we see you again, you're dead." We didn't need to be told twice. We scrambled into the car, and I gunned the engine, tires squealing as we took off. In the rearview mirror, I could see the masked men calmly walking back to their vehicles. We drove in tense silence for several minutes, both of us shaking with adrenaline and fear. Finally, when we were a few miles down the road, Jessica broke down sobbing. I pulled over and held her, my own eyes welling up with tears. We sat there for a long time, clinging to each other, overwhelmed by what had just happened. When we had calmed down enough to speak, we tried to make sense of it all. Who were those men? Why did they target us? How did they coordinate blocking us in like that? We debated going to the police, but we had no evidence. No phones to show our location data, no photos, nothing. Just our word against theirs. And frankly, we were both too shaken and eager to get home to deal with filing a report. The rest of the drive passed in a daze. We jumped at every set of headlights, convinced they were coming back for us. By the time we finally made it home, the sun was starting to rise. We called our banks and canceled our cards, filed a police report over the phone, changed all our passwords, but we still didn't feel safe. For weeks afterwards, I had nightmares about those blank white masks. Jessica couldn't stand being alone in the house. We both struggled with anxiety and paranoia. Even now, months later, I still get chills thinking about that night. The utter helplessness we felt. The violation of our sense of safety. I've never felt so vulnerable in my life. We don't do long road trips anymore, especially not at night. I'm not sure we ever will again. The open road used to represent freedom and adventure to me. Now it just fills me with dread. I know we were lucky. It could have been so much worse. But the trauma of that experience lingers. I'm writing this now in hopes that sharing my story might help others stay vigilant and safe. You never think something like this will happen to you. But the world can be a dangerous place. All it takes is being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Stay alert, trust your instincts, and always have a plan. You never know when you might need it. I was exhausted after a long day of driving when my old sedan finally gave out. The engine sputtered and died as I pulled onto the shoulder of the lonely mountain road, thick forest pressing in on both sides. My 4-year-old daughter, Emma, was fast asleep in her car seat, oblivious to our predicament. As the realization of our situation sank in, my heart started to race. We were miles from anywhere, with no cell service and barely any traffic on this remote stretch of highway. The sun was already dipping below the tree line, painting the sky in ominous shades of red and purple. I tried to stay calm as I went through my options, but panic was creeping in around the edges. I couldn't just sit here and wait for help that might never come. Emma was safe in the locked car for now, but we had limited food and water. I had to try to find assistance before it got completely dark. Making the agonizing decision to leave my sleeping daughter, I scribbled a quick note explaining where I'd gone in case anyone came by. Then I set out on foot down the road, hoping to encounter a house or gas station within a reasonable distance. The forest loomed on either side as I walked briskly along the shoulder. Every snapping twig or rustle in the underbrush made me jump. The fading light cast strange shadows, and my imagination ran wild with thoughts of what might be lurking just out of sight. I kept picturing Emma alone in the car and had to fight the urge to turn back. After about 20 minutes of walking, I spotted a dirt road branching off into the woods. A battered wooden sign indicated it led to Whispering Pines Cabins. My spirits lifted slightly. Maybe I could find someone there to help us. I hesitated for a moment before leaving the main road, but reasoned this was my best chance of getting assistance quickly. The narrow dirt lane twisted through the dense forest, branches scraping against my arms as I hurried along. An uneasy feeling crept over me the further I went. The cabin rental sign had looked old and worn. What if this place wasn't even in business anymore? But I pressed on, driven by desperation and maternal instinct. Finally, I emerged into a small clearing where a rustic log cabin stood. My relief at finding signs of civilization was tempered by the cabin's decrepit appearance. The windows were dark, and vines crept up the weathered walls. Still, I approached and knocked firmly on the front door, praying someone was home. To my shock, the door creaked open almost immediately. A tall, gaunt man with wild gray hair and a scraggly beard peered out at me. His pale blue eyes seemed to glow in the twilight as he regarded me suspiciously. Can you help me?" I stammered, suddenly unsure if I'd made a terrible mistake coming here. "My car broke down on the highway, and my little girl is still—" "Highway's that way," the man interrupted, jerking his thumb over his shoulder. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble. "About 1.5 miles. You best head back 'fore it gets dark." He started to close the door, but I desperately stuck my foot in the gap. "Please," I begged. "I can't walk all that way in the dark. Do you have a phone I could use? Or could you drive me back to my car? I'll pay you, I swear." The man's eyes narrowed as he considered me for a long moment. I held my breath, terrified he would refuse. Finally, he grunted and opened the door wider. "Name's John," he said gruffly. "Ain't got no phone, but I suppose I can give you a ride. Wouldn't be right, leaving a little one out there alone." Waves of relief washed over me as I followed John around to a battered pickup truck parked behind the cabin. As unsettling as this strange mountain man was, he seemed to be my only hope of reuniting with Emma quickly. We bounced and jolted down the rutted dirt road in tense silence. John drove with grim concentration, expertly navigating the treacherous path. I kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead, trying to spot any landmarks I recognized. But in the deepening gloom, everything looked alien and menacing. My thoughts raced as we neared the highway. What if Emma had woken up alone and scared? What if someone else had come along and taken her? The possibilities tormented me, each worse than the last. I silently berated myself for leaving her, even though I'd had little choice. We finally reached the main road, and I directed John to where I'd left my car. As we rounded a bend, my heart leapt into my throat. The shoulder where I'd parked was empty. "No, no, no," I moaned, scanning the area frantically. "It was right here, I swear." John pulled over, peering into the darkness. "You sure this is the spot, ma'am?" "Yes, I know it was here." Panic overwhelmed me as I fumbled with my seatbelt. I had to find Emma, had to know she was safe. Just then, a pair of headlights appeared around the curve ahead. As the vehicle drew closer, I realized with a jolt that it was my car. A highway patrol officer was behind the wheel, and I could just make out Emma's little face in the back seat. Tears of relief streamed down my face as I scrambled out of John's truck. The officer pulled up alongside us, looking concerned. "Ma'am, is this your vehicle?" he asked as he got out. We found it abandoned with a child inside. Can you explain what's going on here? I quickly recounted the situation through my tears, gesturing to John as I explained how he'd helped me. The officer's stern expression softened as he listened. I understand you were in a difficult spot, but leaving a child alone is extremely dangerous, he admonished gently. You're lucky nothing happened. In the future, please stay with your vehicle and try to flag down help. I nodded contritely, too overcome with emotion to speak. All I wanted was to hold my daughter. The officer helped me get Emma, still groggy from sleep, out of her car seat. I clutched her to my chest, inhaling her familiar scent as she snuggled against me. While the officer ran my license and registration, I turned to thank John, but the old man and his truck had vanished without a trace. I blinked in confusion, wondering how he could have left so quickly and silently. The officer returned, handing back my documents. Looks like you just had some bad luck with an old car, he said. The engine's shot, but I can give you a ride into town. There's a mechanic there who can tow your vehicle in the morning. As we drove away in the patrol car, I hugged Emma close and stared out the window into the dark forest. A chill ran down my spine as I pondered the strange events of the evening. Had John been real or some kind of guardian angel? I would never know for sure, but I silently thanked whatever forces had brought us safely through our harrowing ordeal in the wilderness. The experience left an indelible mark on me. For months afterwards, I had vivid nightmares about being lost in those woods, desperately searching for Emma. I became almost pathologically cautious about car maintenance and always kept an emergency kit stocked. But along with the lingering fear, I also felt profound gratitude. The kindness of strangers, both John and the highway patrol officer, had seen us through a potentially disastrous situation. It was a powerful reminder that even in our darkest moments, help can come from unexpected places. Now, years later, I still think about that night whenever we drive through remote areas. I hold Emma's hand a little tighter and say a silent prayer of thanks that we made it through. The memory of those terrifying hours alone in the forest will stay with me always, a stark reminder of a mother's love and the thin line between safety and danger in this unpredictable world. I was always the adventurous type, seeking thrills in remote places, but nothing could have prepared me for the harrowing ordeal I endured in the Mojave Desert last summer. What started as an exciting solo road trip turned into a desperate fight for survival that pushed me to my absolute limits. It was mid-July, and I had decided to take a week off work to explore some of the desert landscapes in California and Nevada. I packed up my old Jeep with camping gear, plenty of water and snacks, and hit the road full of excitement for the journey ahead. The first few days were incredible. I camped under star-filled skies, hiked among towering rock formations, and felt totally free and at peace. On the fourth day, I decided to venture deeper into a particularly remote area, following some rough dirt roads that snaked through the barren landscape. The scenery was breathtaking, all ruddy canyons and wind-sculpted boulders. I was loving every minute of it, feeling like a true explorer. In hindsight, I should have paid more attention to my fuel gauge. I had gotten so caught up in the thrill of discovery that I failed to notice how low I was running. It wasn't until the Jeep suddenly sputtered and died that the gravity of my situation hit me. I was stranded in the middle of nowhere, at least 50 miles from the nearest town, with no cell service. At first, I tried not to panic. I had several gallons of water with me, some trail mix and energy bars. Surely someone would come along this road eventually, and I could flag them down for help. I decided to wait it out in the Jeep rationing my supplies. But as the hours ticked by under the blistering sun, my confidence began to waver. The temperature climbed to well over 100 degrees, turning the Jeep into an oven. I was sweating profusely, going through my water far too quickly. By nightfall, no other vehicles had passed by. I realized I would need to take action if I wanted to survive. At first light the next morning, I gathered what supplies I could carry in my backpack and set out on foot, hoping to find help. I left a note on the Jeep's windshield explaining my situation in case anyone came across it. The smart move would have been to stay put, but fear and desperation were clouding my judgment. Those first few hours of walking were grueling but manageable. I stuck to the dirt road, figuring it had to lead somewhere eventually. But as the sun climbed higher, the heat became unbearable. The air shimmered with mirages, warping the landscape. My mouth was bone dry no matter how much I sipped from my dwindling water supply. By midday, I was in serious trouble. My skin was burning, my head pounding. Each step was a monumental effort. I started hallucinating, seeing oases that would vanish as I approached. At one point, I could have sworn I saw my Jeep appear on the horizon, but when I blinked, it was gone. I don't know exactly when I collapsed. One moment I was stumbling forward, the next I was face down in the scorching sand. I couldn't muster the strength to get up. This is it, I thought. This is how I die, alone in this God-forsaken desert. As I drifted in and out of consciousness, I had vivid visions of my life flashing before my eyes. I saw my parents, my childhood home, past loves and heartbreaks. I felt profound regret for all the things I'd left unsaid and undone. If only I could have one more chance. Just when I had given up all hope, I heard the distant rumble of an engine. At first, I was sure it was another hallucination, but the sound grew louder, more real. With my last ounce of strength, I lifted my head and saw a battered pickup truck bouncing down the road toward me. The next few hours were a blur. An old man, my guardian angel, had found me just in time. He got me into his truck and sped to the nearest gas station, about 30 miles away. The employees there called an ambulance while giving me water and electrolytes. I spent 2 days in the hospital being treated for severe dehydration and heat exhaustion. The doctors said I was lucky to be alive. If I had been out there much longer, I likely wouldn't have made it. As I lay in that hospital bed, hooked up to IVs, the enormity of what I'd been through started to sink in. I realized how naive and reckless I'd been, venturing into such an unforgiving environment without proper preparation. I'd always seen myself as tough and self-reliant, but the desert had humbled me. It showed me just how fragile human life is, how quickly things can go from adventure to nightmare. The experience changed me profoundly. I gained a new appreciation for the raw power of nature and the importance of respecting it. I became more cautious and methodical in my outdoor pursuits, always erring on the side of over-preparation. But I also developed a deeper gratitude for life itself and for the kindness of strangers like the man who saved me. In the months since my ordeal, I've struggled with lingering trauma. I have nightmares about being lost in an endless expanse of sand. Sometimes when it's really hot outside, I get panicky flashbacks to those desperate hours in the desert. But I'm working through it with therapy, determined not to let fear hold me back from living fully. I still love nature and adventure, but now I approach it with a hard-earned wisdom. I always tell people about my experience as a cautionary tale. It's so easy to underestimate the dangers out there, to think you're invincible. But the desert doesn't care how tough you think you are. It will break you down and strip you bare if you're not careful. Looking back, I'm amazed I survived. So many little things could have gone differently. If that man hadn't driven by when he did, if I'd wandered off the road, if I'd run out of water sooner. I feel like I was given a second chance at life, and I don't intend to waste it. These days, I find beauty in smaller adventures, a hike in a local park, camping at an established site, even just sitting in my backyard watching the sunset. I've learned that you don't have to push yourself to the brink to appreciate the wonders of the world. Sometimes the most profound experiences come when you slow down and really pay attention to your surroundings. But I'll never forget those harrowing hours in the Mojave. The sheer emptiness of the landscape, the relentless sun beating down, the creeping panic as I realized how dire my situation was. It was terrifying, but also awe-inspiring in a way. The desert is so vast and indifferent, it really puts human existence into perspective. I often think about that old man who found me. I never even got his name in all the chaos, but I owe him my life. His simple act of kindness in stopping to help a stranger made all the difference. It reminds me that even in the harshest environments, human compassion can flourish. So that's my story, how a carefree road trip turned into a desperate battle for survival. I hope others can learn from my mistakes without having to go through such an ordeal themselves. Always be prepared, respect nature, and never take your safety for granted. The wilderness can be beautiful, but it can also be deadly if you're not careful. I learned that lesson the hard way, but I'm grateful to be alive to share it. Suddenly, bright headlights appeared in my rearview mirror. A large pickup truck was barreling towards me at an alarming speed. I figured they'd pass me quickly, but instead the truck slowed and started tailgating me aggressively, their headlights flooding my car with blinding light. My heart started racing. What did this person want? Were they drunk? I sped up a bit, hoping they'd back off, but the truck matched my speed perfectly, staying right on my bumper. I tried to stay calm, telling myself they'd get bored soon and leave me alone. But after a few more minutes of this, I was really starting to panic. I pressed harder on the gas, pushing my old Honda Civic faster than I'd normally dare on these twisting back roads. The speedometer crept up, 60, 65, 70 mph, way too fast for these conditions, but I was scared out of my mind. The truck stayed glued to my rear bumper the whole time. How were they able to follow so closely at such high speeds? My palms were sweating as I gripped the steering wheel, trying desperately to keep control of my car. Suddenly the truck's engine roared, and it swerved into the oncoming lane, pulling up alongside me. I risked a glance over, but couldn't make out the driver in the darkness. They were matching my speed exactly. Then, without warning, they swerved towards me. I jerked the wheel hard to avoid them, nearly losing control. My tires screeched as I fought to stay on the road. The truck backed off momentarily, then surged forward again, ramming into my rear bumper with a sickening crunch of metal. I screamed and stomped on the gas, my engine whining in protest as I pushed it to its limits. The speedometer was brushing 90 now. I was certain we'd both crash at any moment on these dangerous curves. But some survival instinct had taken over, and all I could think about was escape. The minutes stretched on endlessly as this terrifying chase continued. My arms ached from gripping the wheel so tightly. Sweat dripped into my eyes. I was hyperventilating, on the verge of passing out from sheer terror. Up ahead, I spotted a turnoff, some kind of dirt access road into the forest. Without thinking, I yanked the wheel hard and careened onto it, praying the truck wouldn't be able to follow. My car bounced violently as I sped down the unpaved road, branches whipping against the windows. To my horror, I heard the roar of the truck's engine behind me. They'd made the turn too. Rocks pinged against my undercarriage as I pushed my poor car to its absolute limit. Tree trunks blurred past in the darkness. One wrong move and I'd be wrapped around one of them. The road curved sharply and I felt my back tires start to slide. I steered into the skid, barely maintaining control. The truck wasn't so lucky. I heard a tremendous crash and the sound of breaking glass and crunching metal. Glancing in my mirror, I saw the truck had slammed into a tree. I wanted to feel relieved, but terror still gripped me. What if they weren't stopped? What if they came after me on foot? I kept driving as fast as I dared down the twisting dirt road, looking desperately for any sign of civilization. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 minutes, the trees started to thin. I burst out onto a paved road and nearly cried with relief when I saw streetlights in the distance. I sped towards them, my whole body shaking. As I entered the small town, I immediately spotted a police station and screeched into the parking lot. I ran inside, barely able to speak as I gasped out my story to the startled officer at the desk. They quickly dispatched cars to search for the truck while another officer took my statement. I sat there trembling as dawn slowly broke outside. The police never found any sign of the truck that had chased me. My own car was pretty banged up, with a crumpled rear bumper and scrapes all along one side, but I was alive. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened that night. Why did that person chase me? What did they want? The police suggested it may have been someone on drugs, or maybe some sick person getting their thrills from terrorizing random drivers, but they never found any leads. I avoid driving alone at night now. The sound of an engine behind me still makes my heart race. I keep replaying that chase in my mind, wondering what would have happened if I hadn't found that dirt road, if the truck hadn't crashed. The terror of those moments will stay with me forever. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. It seems too bizarre, too terrifying to have actually happened. But then I look at the damage to my car, the scrapes and dents that prove it was all too real. I'm sharing this as a warning to others. Be careful out there on dark, lonely roads. You never know what kind of madness might be lurking, waiting to chase you down. I was driving through the Southwest desert, enjoying the solitude of my solo road trip. The sun was setting, painting the sky in vibrant oranges and pinks. It was breathtaking, but I knew I needed to find a place to stop soon before it got too dark. My gas gauge was getting low, so I was relieved when I spotted a small gas station up ahead. As I pulled in, I noticed how isolated it was. Just a tiny building and a couple of rusty pumps surrounded by miles of empty desert. I parked at one of the pumps and got out to fill up my tank. The air was still hot and dry, and eerily quiet except for the buzz of insects. As I was pumping gas, I heard the creak of the station's screen door opening. An older man in dirty overalls came out and stared at me silently. Something about his gaze made me uneasy. I gave him a polite nod and smile, but he just kept staring. I tried to focus on finishing up with the gas, but I could feel his eyes boring into me. My skin crawled. When the tank was full, I replaced the nozzle and screwed the gas cap back on. I just wanted to get back in my car and leave, but I needed to go inside to pay. As I walked towards the building, the man finally spoke. "You ain't from round here, are ya?" His voice was gravelly and unfriendly. "No, just passing through," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. I didn't want him to sense how nervous he was making me. He grunted and held the door open for me. I muttered a quick thanks and hurried inside, glad to be away from his stare. But the interior of the station wasn't much better. It was dimly lit and smelled musty. Shelves of expired snacks and dusty trinkets lined the walls. Behind the counter stood a rail-thin woman with stringy gray hair. Her eyes were sunken and vacant as she regarded me. "Evening," I said, forcing a smile. "Just need to pay for my gas." She didn't respond, just kept staring. I was starting to feel like I was in some kind of horror movie. I pulled out my wallet, hands shaking slightly. "How much do I owe you?" I asked. Still no response. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something was very wrong here. Just then, the bell above the door jingled. I turned to see two more men enter, younger than the first guy, but with the same hard, unfriendly look in their eyes. They positioned themselves near the door, effectively blocking the exit. My heart started racing. I needed to get out of there now. "You know what? I think I left my credit card in the car," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll just run out and grab it." I took a step towards the door, but one of the men moved to block my path. "What's your hurry, sweetheart?" he drawled, a nasty grin spreading across his face. "Why don't you stay and chat a while?" I felt panic rising in my chest. This was bad, really bad. I looked around frantically for another way out, but I was trapped. "Please," I said, my voice shaking. "I really need to get going. Just let me pay and leave." The old woman behind the counter finally spoke, her voice a raspy whisper. "Oh, honey, you ain't going nowhere." A chill ran down my spine. What did they want with me? My mind raced through horrible possibilities. I clutched my keys tightly in my pocket. Maybe if I could just get to my car. I made a sudden dash for the door, trying to squeeze past the men, but they were ready for me. Strong hands grabbed my arms, yanking me back. I screamed and thrashed, but their grip was like iron. "Let me go," I yelled, kicking out wildly. My foot connected with one guy's shin, and he grunted in pain. "Feisty little thing, ain't she?" The other man chuckled darkly. "I like 'em feisty." Tears of fear and frustration streamed down my face as they dragged me towards a back room. I had to get away, but how? Just then, bright headlights swept across the windows as a car pulled into the station. The men froze, their grips loosening slightly. It was now or never. I wrenched myself free and bolted for the door, slamming into it with my full weight. The bell jangled wildly as I burst outside. I sprinted for my car, fumbling with my keys. Behind me, I heard angry shouts and pounding footsteps. My hands shook as I tried to get the key in the lock. Just as I yanked the door open, rough hands grabbed me from behind. I screamed, kicking and flailing. Suddenly, car doors slammed and new voices shouted, "Hey, what's going on over there?" My attackers hesitated. In that split second, I managed to wrench free and dive into my car. I jammed the key in the ignition and the engine roared to life. I threw the car in reverse and stomped on the gas, tires squealing. As I peeled out of the station, I caught a glimpse of a confused family standing by their minivan, staring at the scene. I sped off into the darkness, hands shaking on the wheel. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I kept checking my rearview mirror, terrified I'd see headlights following me. But the road behind me remained empty. I drove for hours, too scared to stop. My mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. Who were those people? What would they have done to me if that family hadn't shown up? When the first light of dawn appeared on the horizon, I finally allowed myself to pull over at a busy truck stop. As soon as I put the car in park, I broke down sobbing. The fear and adrenaline of the night caught up with me all at once. After I calmed down a bit, I went inside to use the bathroom and splash some water on my face. As I stared at my reflection, pale, puffy-eyed, shell-shocked, I debated whether to call the police. But what would I even tell them? I hadn't gotten a good look at the men's faces or the name of the gas station. And who would believe such a crazy story anyway? In the end, I decided to just keep driving and put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. I wasn't going to let it ruin the rest of my trip. But even now, months later, I still have nightmares about those cold, predatory eyes and grasping hands. I wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were just trying to rob me. Maybe I overreacted. But deep down, I know something far more sinister was going on at that isolated desert gas station. I shudder to think what might have happened if that family hadn't pulled in when they did. Their headlights saved me from God knows what fate. I'll never know for sure what those people wanted with me or why they targeted me. But one thing's for certain. I'll never take another solo road trip through the desert again. And if I see a remote gas station like that, I don't care if I'm running on fumes. I'm driving right past. The experience shook me to my core and made me realize how vulnerable we can be, especially when traveling alone. I'm much more cautious now and always make sure someone knows where I am. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. It seems so surreal, like something out of a horror movie. But then I remember the terror I felt, the bruises on my arms from their grip, and I know it was all too real. I've tried to find information about similar incidents in that area, but haven't come across anything concrete. Part of me wants answers, wants to know who those people were and if they've hurt anyone else. But another part of me is too afraid to dig any deeper, so I try to move on with my life and not dwell on it. But I know I'll never forget that night. The menacing stares, the panic rising in my throat, the relief of those headlights appearing just in time. It was the closest I've ever come to true terror, and I hope I never experience anything like it again. To anyone reading this, especially solo female travelers, please be careful out there. Trust your instincts. If a situation feels off, get out of there. Don't worry about seeming rude or paranoid. Your safety is what matters most. And if you're ever driving through the Southwest and come across an isolated gas station as the sun is setting, just keep driving. You never know what might be waiting for you in the gathering darkness of the desert night. We'd been driving for hours, my wife Emma, our 2 kids Lily and Jack, and me. The kids were getting restless in the back seat, constantly asking, "Are we there yet?" We decided to stop for the night in this small town called Millbrook. It was already dark when we pulled in, and the streets were deserted. There was an eerie quiet hanging over everything. We found a rundown motel on the outskirts of town, the Millbrook Inn. The flickering neon sign cast an ominous red glow. I remember thinking it looked like something out of a horror movie, but I brushed it off. We were all exhausted and just wanted to sleep. The lobby was dimly lit and musty. An old man with sunken eyes sat behind the desk, barely acknowledging us as we checked in. He wordlessly handed over a rusty key and pointed down the hall. Our room was small and shabby, with peeling wallpaper and stained carpets, but we were too tired to care. We got the kids settled and collapsed into bed ourselves. I jolted awake some time later to a loud bang on our door. My heart racing, I checked the time. 3:17 a.m. Emma stirred beside me. "What was that?" she whispered. Bang, bang, bang. The pounding came again, harder this time. I jumped out of bed and peered through the peephole. The hallway was pitch black. "Who's there?" I called out. No response. The banging stopped for a moment. Then it resumed, even more frenzied than before. The door rattled in its frame. Emma was up now too, gathering the kids who had woken up crying. "We need to get out of here," she said, panic in her voice. I tried calling the front desk, but the phone was dead. The pounding continued relentlessly. Suddenly, We heard a sickening crack as the door began to splinter. Dark shapes loomed in the growing gap. Adrenaline surging, I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a lamp, and smashed it through the window. "Go!" I yelled to Emma. She climbed through first, then helped the kids. I scrambled out last, cutting my hands on the broken glass. We took off running down the empty street, the sound of splintering wood echoing behind us. I glanced back and saw multiple shadowy figures pouring out of our room. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. We sprinted as fast as we could, half dragging the kids along. Lily was sobbing, and Jack kept asking what was happening. I had no answers. The town was completely deserted. Not a single light on in any building. No cars, no people. Just an oppressive silence broken only by our ragged breathing and pounding footsteps. We turned down another street and I spotted a gas station up ahead. Relief flooded through me. Maybe we could find help there. As we got closer, I saw that the station was closed and dark like everything else. But there was a payphone outside. We huddled around it as I frantically dialed 911 with shaking fingers. To my immense relief, it actually rang. A dispatcher answered and I frantically explained our situation, begging them to send help. They said a patrol car was on the way. We waited there at the gas station, huddled together and jumping at every little sound. I kept my eyes locked on the road we'd come from, terrified of seeing those dark figures appear. After what felt like an eternity, we saw headlights approaching. I've never been so glad to see a police car in my life. The officer who stepped out looked confused. He said they hadn't had any reports of disturbances in town. When we described the motel and tried to lead him there, we couldn't find it. It was like it had vanished into thin air. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened that night. We never stopped at another small town on a road trip again. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, hearing that pounding on the door. Whatever was trying to get to us in Millbrook, I'm just grateful we escaped. I know this story sounds crazy. If I hadn't lived through it myself, I wouldn't believe it. But I swear every word is true. That night in Millbrook will haunt me for the rest of my life. The police searched the area but found no trace of the motel or any unusual activity. They clearly thought we were making it up or hallucinating. But how could all four of us have the same delusion? In the days and weeks that followed, I obsessively researched Millbrook and that stretch of highway. I found a few vague reports of other travelers having strange experiences there, but nothing concrete. It was like the town only existed for that one night. The experience put a strain on our family. Emma and I argued constantly, stressed and on edge. The kids had nightmares for months. We ended up in family therapy trying to process the trauma. I became paranoid, installing extra locks and security cameras at our house. I'd stay up late into the night, watching the monitors for any sign of those shadowy figures. Sometimes I wonder if we accidentally stumbled into some kind of parallel dimension that night, or if Millbrook is some kind of paranormal trap for unwary travelers. I've even considered the possibility that we all shared some kind of mass hallucination, but deep down, I know what I saw and experienced was real. The terror I felt as that door splintered open, the burning in my lungs as we ran for our lives, the relief of seeing that police car appear. It was all too vivid, too visceral to have been imagined. I still get chills when I think about what might have happened if we hadn't escaped. What were those things that tried to break into our room? What did they want with us? These questions haunt me, but I know I'll probably never get answers. All I can do is be grateful that we made it out alive and try to move on with our lives. But a part of me will always be back in that motel room, heart racing as I hear that first bang on the door. Millbrook took something from us that night, our sense of safety, our peace of mind, and I don't think we'll ever fully get it back. I'm sharing this story as a warning to other travelers. If you're on a long road trip and come across a small town that seems too quiet, too empty, don't stop. Keep driving no matter how tired you are. It's not worth the risk. And if you ever find yourself anywhere near Millbrook, get as far away as you can. Some places aren't meant for outsiders. Some towns are better left alone. I don't know if we'll ever fully recover from that night, but we're trying our best to heal and move forward as a family. We hold each other a little tighter now, grateful for every moment we have together, because we know firsthand how quickly everything can change, how thin the veil is between safety and terror, and how lucky we were to make it out of Millbrook alive. The day started off perfectly. The weather was ideal, sunny, with a light ocean breeze. I cruised down the winding coastal road with the windows down, letting the salty air whip through my hair. The scenery was breathtaking, with steep cliffs plunging down to the crashing waves below. I stopped a few times to snap photos and explore little beach coves. As the sun began to set, I decided to push on a bit further before finding a place to stay for the night. That's when things started to go wrong. The sky grew dark quickly, and a heavy fog rolled in off the ocean. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. I slowed way down, struggling to see the road ahead. My headlights barely penetrated the thick mist. I started to get an uneasy feeling, realizing how isolated I was out here. There were no other cars around, and I hadn't passed any towns in quite a while. Suddenly, my car started making a horrible grinding noise. The engine sputtered and died, leaving me stranded on the side of the road. Panic set in as I tried repeatedly to restart it, but it was no use. I had no cell service to call for help. My heart raced as I weighed my options. Should I wait and hope another car came by, or try to find help on foot? After about 20 minutes of sitting there in the eerie silence, I made the fateful decision to set out on foot. I grabbed my phone and a small flashlight, locked the car, and started walking. The fog swirled around me as I made my way down the empty road. Every sound made me jump. Was that just the wind in the trees, or something more sinister? I had been walking for maybe 10 minutes when I saw a faint light in the distance. Relief washed over me as I quickened my pace towards it. As I got closer, I could make out the silhouette of an old farmhouse set back from the road. Thank God, I thought. Surely someone there could help me. I hurried up the long gravel driveway, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly. The house loomed before me, a dilapidated 2-story structure that had clearly seen better days. Paint was peeling off the weathered siding, and several windows were boarded up. But a dim light glowed from inside, so someone had to be home. I climbed the creaky steps onto the front porch and knocked on the door. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. "Hello?" I called out. "Is anyone home? My car broke down and I need help." I heard slow, heavy footsteps approaching from inside. The porch floorboards groaned as someone's weight shifted behind the door. A feeling of dread crept over me. Something didn't feel right. The door creaked open, revealing a tall, gaunt man with sunken eyes and a wild gray beard. He glared at me suspiciously. "What do you want?" he growled. I stammered out an explanation about my car trouble, asking if I could use a phone to call for help. The whole time, the man's eyes bored into me with an unsettling intensity. He didn't say a word as I spoke, just kept staring. Finally, he grunted and jerked his head, motioning for me to come inside. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I was desperate. I cautiously stepped over the threshold into a dimly lit entryway. The musty smell of decay assaulted my nose. "Phone's in the kitchen," the man muttered, shuffling ahead of me down a narrow hallway. I followed hesitantly, my skin crawling. We passed a living room filled with piles of newspapers and old furniture draped in sheets. In the kitchen, the man pointed to an ancient rotary phone on the wall. As I moved towards it, I caught sight of something that made my blood run cold. A wall covered in dozens of photographs. They were all of different people, mostly young women, but their eyes had been scratched out in every single picture. I froze, my heart pounding. The man was blocking the doorway, watching me intently. His lips curled into a horrifying grin, revealing yellowed teeth. "Go on," he said in a raspy voice. "Make your call." In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that if I didn't get out of there immediately, I would die in this house. With a surge of adrenaline, I bolted for the hallway. The man lunged at me, his bony fingers grasping at my shirt. I ducked under his arm and sprinted for the front door. I could hear him right behind me, snarling with rage. I yanked open the door and flew down the porch steps. Instead of going back down the driveway, I veered off into the woods beside the house. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush. The man's heavy footsteps pounded after me. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, fueled by sheer terror. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but I didn't dare slow down. I could hear him crashing through the trees behind me, getting closer. Suddenly the ground dropped away beneath my feet. I tumbled down a steep embankment, rolling over rocks and fallen logs. Pain shot through my body as I came to a stop at the bottom. Dazed, I struggled to my feet. I heard the man shouting in the distance, but it sounded further away now. I had to keep moving. I limped forward as quickly as I could, ignoring the stabbing pain in my ankle. The trees thinned out, and I found myself on the edge of a cliff overlooking the ocean far below. Trapped between the cliff and my pursuer, panic threatened to overwhelm me. But then I spotted a narrow path leading down the cliffside. Without hesitation, I started scrambling down it. Loose rocks skittered away under my feet. One misstep, and I would plummet to my death on the jagged rocks below. The man's shouts grew closer again. I chanced a glance up and saw his shadowy form at the top of the cliff. He started down the path after me. I redoubled my efforts, half climbing, half sliding down the treacherous slope. Just when I thought my arms and legs would give out, I reached the bottom. A small strip of beach stretched out before me, littered with driftwood and boulders. I darted between the massive rocks, trying to stay out of sight. I don't know how long I ran along that beach. Time seemed to blur together in a haze of fear and exhaustion. Eventually, I couldn't hear the man's shouts anymore. I found a small cave formed by some fallen boulders and crawled inside, collapsing in utter exhaustion. I must have passed out for a while. When I came to, pale morning light was filtering into the cave. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest as I dragged myself out onto the beach. I was battered, bruised, and covered in cuts and scratches, but I was alive. It took me hours to make my way back up to the highway. A kind couple finally stopped and gave me a ride to the nearest town, where I immediately went to the police. They sent officers out to investigate the farmhouse, but found it completely abandoned. There was no sign of the terrifying man or the wall of photos I had seen. To this day, I don't know who that man was or what horrors went on in that house. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I look at the scars on my hands and legs from that frantic flight through the woods, and I know it was all too real. I'll never forget the madness in that man's eyes, or how close I came to becoming another scratched-out photo on his wall. Needless to say, I stick to well-populated areas on my travels these days. You never know what's lurking out there in the darkness. I was on a solo road trip through the Pacific Northwest, cruising down a winding mountain road surrounded by towering evergreens. The crisp air and stunning scenery had me in high spirits as I sang along to the radio. Little did I know my peaceful drive was about to turn into a fight for survival. As I rounded a sharp bend, I noticed a beat-up pickup truck in my rearview mirror. It was moving fast, weaving erratically. At first, I thought the driver must be drunk, but as it got closer, I saw multiple men in the truck bed, all wearing hunting gear. A chill ran down my spine when I realized they were staring right at me. Suddenly, the truck accelerated and rammed into my back bumper. The impact jolted me forward, and I gripped the steering wheel in terror. What the hell? This couldn't be happening. The hunters whooped and hollered as they slammed into me again. I floored the gas pedal, my tires screeching as I sped up. My mind raced as I tried to process what was happening. Why were they attacking me? I was just an ordinary guy on vacation. But there was no time to ponder. I had to focus on escaping. The road twisted treacherously through the mountains. I took the hairpin turns as fast as I dared, praying I wouldn't lose control. The maniacs in the pickup were relentless. They'd back off just long enough to build up speed, then ram me again. Each impact sent a jolt of fear through my body. I couldn't shake them no matter how fast I went. My palms were sweating as I gripped the wheel, knuckles white. Up ahead, the road forked. Without time to think, I jerked the wheel and veered onto the smaller dirt road branching off to the right. It was rougher terrain, but I hoped I could lose them. No such luck. The hunters whooped with glee as they followed me onto the bumpy path. Rocks and branches pelted my car as I tore down the dirt road. The suspension groaned in protest at the abuse. I stole a glance in the mirror and saw one of the men raising a rifle. Oh, God, were they going to shoot me? A gunshot rang out and I instinctively ducked. The bullet pinged off my roof, inches from the back window. Terror unlike anything I'd ever felt coursed through me. This was real. They were trying to kill me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pushed my car to its limits. The engine roared as I accelerated on the rough road. Another gunshot, another near miss. I had to get away. The road grew narrower, hugging the edge of a steep cliff. Loose pebbles skittered off the edge as my tires came frightfully close. One wrong move and I'd plummet to my death. But slowing down wasn't an option with armed lunatics on my tail. I don't know how long the chase lasted. It felt like hours, though it was probably only 15 or 20 minutes. My nerves were frayed to the breaking point. Just when I thought I couldn't take any more, I spotted a turnout up ahead. It was my only chance. I slammed on the brakes and cranked the wheel, skidding into the turnout in a cloud of dust. Without hesitating, I flung open the door and sprinted for the tree line. Behind me, I heard the screech of brakes and angry shouts. I plunged into the thick forest, branches whipping my face as I ran blindly. Gunshots peppered the trees around me. Splinters of bark exploded next to my head. I zigzagged wildly, desperate to avoid their aim. My lungs burned as I gulped for air. Just keep moving. Don't look back. The sounds of pursuit spurred me on, even as my legs threatened to give out. I lost all sense of direction as I crashed through the undergrowth. Thorns tore at my clothes and skin. I tripped over roots and stumbled down small ravines. But the adrenaline kept me going, even as my body screamed in protest. Eventually the sounds of pursuit faded, but I didn't dare stop. I kept moving for what felt like hours, putting as much distance as possible between me and those maniacs. As the adrenaline wore off, exhaustion set in. My legs felt like jelly. My throat was parched. Cuts and bruises throbbed all over. When I finally allowed myself to rest, slumping against a massive fallen log, the reality of my situation hit me. I was lost in the wilderness with no supplies, no phone, and murderous hunters somewhere out there. Despair washed over me. How was I going to survive this? As night fell, the forest grew pitch black. Every snapping twig made me flinch. Were the hunters still out there, searching for me? Or were there other predators lurking in the darkness? I huddled in the hollow of a huge cedar tree, shivering uncontrollably. Sleep was impossible. I kept replaying the terrifying chase in my mind, wondering what I'd done to provoke such violence. The long night finally gave way to a gray dawn. I was stiff, sore, and disoriented, but I knew I had to keep moving. Using the rising sun to orient myself, I set off in what I hoped was an eastward direction. If I could make it out of the wilderness, I'd find help. I walked for hours, fighting through dense underbrush. My stomach growled painfully. I was parched with thirst. When I came across a small stream, I gratefully gulped the cold water, but it did little to assuage my gnawing hunger. As the day wore on, my strength ebbed. My pace slowed to a shuffle. Doubt and despair crept in. What if I was going the wrong way? What if I never made it out? The forest seemed endless. Just when I was ready to give up hope, I heard a faint mechanical sound in the distance. Was that a helicopter? I strained my ears, hardly daring to believe it. Yes, the sound was getting closer. With a surge of desperate energy, I ran toward a small clearing I spotted through the trees. As I burst into the open space, I saw the helicopter circling overhead. I waved my arms frantically, shouting myself hoarse, "Please see me, please!" To my immense relief, the helicopter banked and descended toward the clearing. As it touched down, I saw search and rescue emblazoned on the side. I'd never been so happy to see anything in my life. The rescue team was shocked by my battered appearance and wild story. They'd been searching for me since my abandoned car was found on the mountain road. As they loaded me into the helicopter, I felt overwhelming gratitude and relief wash over me. I was safe. I'd survived. In the days that followed, as I recovered in the hospital, I gave my statement to the police. They took the case seriously, but with no solid leads, the investigation stalled. The remote location and lack of witnesses made it nearly impossible to identify my attackers. I still don't know why those men targeted me that day. Was it some sick hunting game? A case of mistaken identity? Or just random violence? The questions haunt me. I have nightmares about the chase and wake up in a cold sweat. My life has changed forever. I'm jumpier now, always looking over my shoulder. I avoid secluded areas, and I'll never take another solo road trip. But I'm also profoundly grateful to be alive. I gained a new appreciation for the preciousness of life and the resilience of the human spirit. Sometimes I wonder if those hunters are still out there, terrorizing other innocent travelers on lonely mountain roads. The thought chills me to the bone. All I can do is be thankful I escaped, and hope that somehow, someday, justice will catch up to them. Until then, I'll carry this harrowing experience with me always, a reminder of how quickly an ordinary day can turn into a desperate fight for survival. As I rounded a bend in the road, I saw a small town nestled in the valley below. It looked picturesque from a distance. Quaint houses with white picket fences, a main street lined with shops, a church steeple rising above the trees. But as I got closer, I realized something was off. There were no cars moving on the streets, no people walking around. It was the middle of the day, but the town looked completely deserted. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to pull into town to investigate. As I drove down the main street, an eerie silence enveloped me. The only sound was the crunching of my tires on the pavement. I parked in front of what looked like the general store and got out to look around. The stillness was unnerving. There were cars parked along the street, but they were covered in a thin layer of dust. Shop windows displayed merchandise, but no one was inside. It was as if everyone had simply vanished into thin air. I walked down the sidewalk, peering into storefronts. A diner had plates of half-eaten food still sitting on the tables. The bank had stacks of money visible through the window. What kind of emergency would cause people to leave everything behind like this? As I explored further, I noticed other unsettling details. Laundry was hanging from clotheslines, now stiff and faded from exposure to the elements. A child's bicycle lay abandoned on a front lawn, its wheels slowly spinning in the breeze. Every house I passed had cars in the driveways and lights on inside, but no signs of life. My skin began to crawl as I realized just how wrong this all was. I debated getting back in my car and leaving, but my curiosity wouldn't let me go just yet. I needed to understand what had happened here. I decided to enter one of the houses to look for clues. I chose a modest 2-story home with blue shutters. The front door was unlocked. As I stepped inside, the floorboards creaked under my feet. The house smelled musty and stale. In the living room, the TV was still on, playing nothing but static. A newspaper on the coffee table was dated 3 weeks ago. In the kitchen, I found dishes soaking in the sink and a pot of what looked like soup still sitting on the stove. The soup had long since congealed into a moldy mess. Upstairs, the bedrooms looked lived in, but abandoned. Clothes were strewn about, as if the occupants had been in a rush. One bedroom clearly belonged to a teenage girl, with posters of boy bands on the walls and makeup scattered across the dresser. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. There was a dark stain on the carpet near the bed. I knelt down to examine it closer, and my blood ran cold. It was unmistakably dried blood. My heart started racing. What the hell had happened in this town? I needed to get out of there, but I also felt compelled to search for more answers. I hurried back downstairs and out of the house, my mind reeling. Back on the street, I noticed the town hall across the way. If there were any records of what transpired, they would likely be there. I jogged over and went inside. The building was as silent and empty as everywhere else. I made my way to what looked like the mayor's office. Rifling through the papers on the desk, I found meeting minutes from the town council. The most recent one was from about a month ago. As I skimmed it, certain phrases jumped out at me. Strange visitors, unexplained phenomena, mass hallucinations. The council seemed to be grappling with some kind of crisis, but the details were frustratingly vague. I dug deeper into the files and found a hastily scrawled note. It read, "They're here. The darkness is spreading. God help us all." The handwriting was shaky, as if written by someone in a panic. A chill ran down my spine. What kind of darkness were they talking about? And who were these mysterious visitors? I heard a noise outside and my head snapped up. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow move past the window, but when I looked again, there was nothing there. My nerves were frayed. I knew I needed to leave this place immediately. As I hurried back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The silence of the town now felt oppressive, as if something sinister was lying in wait. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking as I tried to unlock the door. Just as I was about to get in, I heard footsteps behind me. I whirled around, but the street was empty. Then I saw it, a dark, writhing mass creeping along the ground towards me. It moved like a living shadow, consuming everything in its path. The air grew cold, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I jumped in my car and peeled out of there as fast as I could. In my rearview mirror, I saw the darkness engulfing the town, blotting out buildings and streets. My tires squealed as I took the curves of the mountain road at dangerous speeds, desperate to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. It wasn't until I was miles away that I finally allowed myself to breathe. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Part of me wanted to convince myself it was all some kind of hallucination or bad dream, but I knew deep down that it was real. In the days and weeks that followed, I scoured news sites and message boards for any information about that town. But I never found anything. No reports of a mass disappearance, no mention of strange phenomena. It was as if the town had never existed. Sometimes I wonder if I should go to the authorities with what I saw. But who would believe such an outlandish story? And what if by speaking about it, I somehow draw the attention of whatever dark force consumed that place? So I've kept it to myself until now, carrying the weight of this terrible secret. But I'll never forget what I saw in that deserted Appalachian town. And I'll always wonder about the fate of those poor souls who vanished without a trace, swallowed up by an inexplicable darkness that defies all rational explanation. I still have nightmares about it sometimes. The eerie silence, the abandoned homes, that creeping shadow coming for me. I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully shake the memory of that day. All I know is that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, and sometimes it's better not to go looking for answers, because you might not like what you find. I was driving cross-country with my 12-year-old son Jake when we stumbled upon the strangest little town I've ever encountered. We had been on the road for hours, winding through empty back roads, when Jake started complaining he was hungry. I'll admit I was getting pretty famished myself, so I decided to take the next exit and look for a place to grab a bite. As we pulled off the highway, I noticed something odd. There were no signs indicating what town we were entering or what services might be available. Just a simple wooden sign that read, "Welcome," in faded paint. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just some tiny place too small to bother with proper signage. We drove down the main street, if you could call it that. It was barely 2 lanes wide, lined with old buildings that had clearly seen better days. Paint was peeling, shingles were missing, and more than a few windows were boarded up. But there were cars parked along the street, and I could see people moving about, so the town wasn't completely abandoned. "This place gives me the creeps, Dad," Jake muttered from the passenger seat. I had to agree. There was definitely an eerie vibe, but I was determined to find some food before getting back on the road. Finally, I spotted what looked like a diner at the end of the street. The neon "open" sign in the window was a welcome sight. I pulled into the small gravel lot, and we headed inside. The bell above the door jingled as we entered, and every head in the place turned to stare at us. And I mean every single person, from the waitress behind the counter to the old men nursing coffee cups to the family in the corner booth. They all stopped mid-conversation and just looked at us. I tried to break the tension with a friendly smile and wave. "Hey folks, just passing through and looking for a quick meal. Mind if we grab a table?" No one responded. They just kept staring, expressions blank and unreadable. After what felt like an eternity of uncomfortable silence, the waitress finally spoke up. "Sit wherever," she said flatly, gesturing vaguely at the mostly empty diner. Jake and I slid into the nearest booth, acutely aware that all eyes were still on us. I could hear hushed whispers start up, but couldn't make out what anyone was saying. Jake looked at me nervously. "Maybe we should just go, Dad," he said quietly. "I'm not that hungry anymore." I wanted to agree with him, but some stubborn part of me insisted on staying. We'd come this far, might as well get some food in our bellies before hitting the road again. I assured Jake it would be fine and picked up a menu. The waitress came over after a few minutes, notepad in hand. "What'll it be?" she asked, not even attempting a smile. I ordered a burger and fries for myself, while Jake asked for chicken tenders. The waitress jotted it down without a word and walked away. As we waited for our food, the whispers around us grew louder. I caught snippets here and there. "Shouldn't be here," "outsiders," "bad omen." My skin crawled as I realized they were talking about us. Jake must have heard too, because he was shrinking down in his seat, trying to make himself as small as possible. I was about to suggest we leave after all when the waitress returned with our plates. She practically slammed them down on the table before stalking away. I looked down at my burger and felt my appetite vanish. The meat looked off, discolored and unappetizing. Jake's chicken tenders were an odd grayish color. "I don't want to eat this," Jake whispered, poking at his food with a fork. I nodded in agreement. "Let's just pay and go," I said, trying to catch the waitress's eye. She pointedly ignored us, so I stood up and approached the counter to settle our bill. As I did, the whispering intensified. I could feel dozens of eyes boring into my back. "How much do we owe?" I asked, forcing a smile. The waitress regarded me coldly. "You're not welcome here," she said, voice dripping with disdain. "You need to leave. Now." I blinked in surprise. "I'm sorry, what? We just stopped for a quick meal. We'll be on our way soon." "Get out!" she suddenly shrieked, causing me to stumble backwards. "We don't want your kind here." The diner erupted into angry shouts. People stood up from their tables, faces contorted with rage. Jake let out a frightened yelp, and I rushed back to grab him. We're going, I said, holding my hands up placatingly as I ushered Jake towards the door. As we burst out of the diner, I was shocked to see a crowd had gathered outside. Word had apparently spread quickly about the outsiders in town. Dozens of people lined the street, all glaring at us with open hostility. We sprinted to our car as shouts and curses followed us. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking as I tried to unlock the doors. Just as I heard footsteps approaching, I managed to get it open. We dove inside, and I peeled out of the parking lot, gravel spraying behind us. In the rearview mirror, I could see people chasing after our car, shaking their fists and yelling. I hit the gas hard, not slowing down until we were well past the town limits and back on the main highway. We drove in stunned silence for several miles before Jake finally spoke up. What was that, Dad? Why did they hate us so much?" I shook my head, still trying to process what had just happened. "I don't know, buddy. I've never experienced anything like that before." "Did you see how they were all staring at us? Like we were monsters or something," Jake said, his voice shaky. "I know. It was bizarre. That whole town felt wrong somehow." We lapsed back into silence for a while, both lost in our own thoughts. I kept replaying the events in my mind, trying to make sense of it all. Had we somehow offended them without realizing? Was there some local custom we'd violated? But their reaction seemed far too extreme for a simple faux pas. As the miles ticked by, I started to doubt my own memory of what had occurred. It all seemed so surreal, like a shared nightmare rather than something that had actually happened. "Hey, Jake," I said suddenly, "what was the name of that town? I don't remember seeing any signs." Jake frowned. I don't know. I can't remember seeing the name anywhere either." A chill ran down my spine. How was that possible? Surely there must have been some indication of where we were. I racked my brain, but came up empty. Let's check the map, I suggested. We'll backtrack our route and figure out where we stopped. But when we pulled over to consult our road atlas, we couldn't find any town marked in that area. Just empty space between the highway and the next major city. It was as if the place didn't exist at all. "This is freaking me out, Dad," Jake said, his eyes wide. I had to agree. None of this made any sense. Towns don't just appear and disappear. People don't react to strangers with such immediate and intense hostility. What the hell had we stumbled into? We eventually made it to our destination that night, but neither of us slept well. I kept jolting awake, half expecting to see those hateful faces glaring at me from the darkness. Jake had nightmares and crawled into my bed around 2 a.m., something he hadn't done since he was little. In the days and weeks that followed, I became obsessed with trying to find some record of that town. I scoured online maps, old atlases, even contacted the State Department of Transportation. But there was no trace of its existence. I asked in forums if anyone else had encountered a similar experience in that area, but got nothing but skepticism in return. Eventually, I had to accept that I might never get answers. To this day, I have no explanation for what Jake and I experienced. Was it some kind of mass hallucination? A town full of people with an extreme fear of outsiders? Or something even stranger that I can't begin to comprehend? All I know is that I'll never forget those hateful stares and the feeling of utter alienation in that place. Jake and I don't talk about it much anymore, but I can tell it still haunts him too. Sometimes when we're driving, I'll catch him scanning the horizon nervously, as if worried we might stumble upon that nightmare town once again. I try to tell myself it was just a bizarre one-off incident, but late at night, when sleep won't come, I find myself wondering, what if there are other places out there like that? Hidden pockets of hostility and strangeness, just waiting for unsuspecting travelers to wander in. The thought never fails to send a shiver down my spine. So if you're ever on a long road trip and find yourself pulling into an unmarked town that gives you an uneasy feeling, my advice is to keep on driving. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. I was exhausted from a long day at work when my girlfriend Lisa suggested we take a spontaneous weekend road trip to clear our heads. It sounded perfect, just the two of us, the open road, and a chance to escape the stress of daily life for a couple days. We quickly packed some bags, hopped in my old Honda Civic, and hit the highway as the sun was setting on Friday evening. The first couple hours of the drive were great. We sang along to our favorite songs, shared some laughs, and felt the tension melting away as the city faded in the rearview mirror. Around 9 p.m., we stopped at a small roadside diner for some coffee and pie. The place was pretty deserted, except for a few truckers hunched over the counter. As we were leaving, I noticed one of them watching us intently. He had a hard, mean look in his eyes that sent a chill down my spine. I hurried Lisa to the car, eager to get back on the road. Not long after we merged back onto the dark highway, I noticed headlights appear in my mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it. This was a major trucking route after all, but after about 20 minutes, I realized the truck behind us hadn't changed position at all. It was maintaining the exact same distance, matching our every speed change. "Hey babe, is it just me or has that truck been following us for a while?" I asked Lisa. She glanced back and frowned. "Yeah, now that you mention it. Weird." I decided to test it out. I sped up about 10 mph over the limit. The truck sped up too. I slowed down to 5 under. The truck slowed down as well, still maintaining that precise distance. My palms started to sweat on the steering wheel. "Okay, this is creeping me out," Lisa said, fear creeping into her voice. "What should we do?" "Let's try to lose them at the next exit," I replied, trying to stay calm for her sake. A few miles later, I spotted an exit sign and quickly veered off without signaling. The truck followed. My heart was really pounding now. This couldn't be a coincidence. We wound through some rural back roads, making random turns, desperately trying to shake our pursuer. But every time I checked the mirror, those headlights were still there. After about 30 minutes of this, we came to a small town. I screeched into a brightly lit gas station, hoping the truck would pass us by. No such luck. It pulled in right behind us, blocking our car in. I killed the engine and we sat there frozen, unsure what to do next. The truck's engine shut off too. We waited in terrified silence for several minutes, but nobody got out. Finally, I steeled my nerves and decided to confront whoever was in there. "Stay in the car and lock the doors," I told Lisa. "If anything happens, honk the horn and scream for help." She nodded, tears in her eyes. I took a deep breath and got out, walking slowly towards the truck. As I approached, I realized it was the same type of semi I'd seen at the diner earlier. My blood ran cold as I connected the dots. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice shaking. "What's your problem? Why are you following us?" No response. The truck's windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. I walked closer, heart thundering in my chest. "I'm calling the cops if you don't explain yourself right now," I yelled, trying to sound braver than I felt. Suddenly, the truck's engine roared to life. I leapt back as it peeled out of the gas station, tires squealing. It fishtailed onto the road and sped off into the night. I ran back to our car, hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. Lisa was sobbing. "It's okay, they're gone," I said, not believing it myself. "Let's get out of here." We drove white-knuckled for the next hour, jumping at every set of headlights we saw. Eventually we reached a larger town and found a motel to hole up in for the night. We were both too freaked out to sleep much. The next morning, we went to the local police station to report what happened. The officer listened patiently to our story, but I could tell he was skeptical. "Look, I know how it sounds," I said, "but I swear every word is true. This truck followed us for hours. Can you at least check for any reports of similar incidents?" He sighed and tapped at his computer for a few minutes. "Well, I don't see anything recent that matches your description, but I'll file a report and we'll keep an eye out. You two be careful out there." We thanked him and left, both feeling unsatisfied. On the drive home, we kept obsessively checking our mirrors, but there was no sign of the mysterious truck. We made it back without incident, but the fear and confusion lingered. It's been a few weeks now, and I still can't shake the memory of that night. I've scoured news sites and online forums, looking for any similar stories, but found nothing conclusive. Lisa and I have mostly stopped talking about it. I think we both want to move on and forget. But late at night, I still find myself lying awake, wondering, who was in that truck? Why did they target us? And most chillingly, will they ever come back? I know we were lucky to escape unharmed, but the not knowing haunts me. Every time I see a semi on the highway now, my heart races. I can't help but scan the driver's face, wondering if it's him. The rational part of my brain says it was probably just some sick prank, but deep down, I can't shake the feeling that there was something more sinister at play, something beyond normal human cruelty. I'm writing this now partly to get it off my chest, and partly as a warning. If you're ever out on a lonely stretch of road and notice you're being followed, don't wait. Don't second-guess yourself. Get somewhere public and safe as fast as you can. You never know what kind of predators are out there, waiting for vulnerable prey. Stay safe out there, folks, and always, always watch your rearview mirror. I was so excited for our honeymoon road trip along the California coast. My new husband Jack and I had been planning it for months. The scenic Pacific Coast Highway, cute little beach towns, wine tasting in Napa. It was going to be the perfect romantic getaway to start our new life together. The first few days were everything we'd dreamed of. We left LA and headed up the coast, stopping to watch the sunset at beautiful beaches, eating fresh seafood, and just enjoying each other's company. I remember thinking how lucky I was and how happy I felt. On the fourth day, we were driving along a more remote stretch of Highway 1 between San Luis Obispo and Big Sur. It was late afternoon, and the golden sunlight was making the ocean views even more spectacular. We had the windows down, music playing, holding hands across the center console. Everything felt perfect. Then I noticed a man standing on the side of the road up ahead, thumb out. He looked a bit scruffy and disheveled, but not alarmingly so. Jack and I exchanged a glance. We weren't really the types to pick up hitchhikers, but something made us pause. Maybe it was the romantic mood, or the beautiful day making us feel generous. Whatever it was, Jack slowed down. "Should we give him a ride?" he asked. "Seems like a pretty desolate stretch of road to be stuck on." I hesitated but nodded. "Yeah, I guess so. But just to the next town, okay?" Jack pulled over, and the man hurried over, grinning widely. He looked to be in his 40s, with wild graying hair and several days of stubble. His clothes were wrinkled and stained. "Hey there, folks," he said cheerfully as he opened the back door. "Thanks so much for stopping. Really appreciate it." As he climbed in, I caught a whiff of stale sweat and something else I couldn't place. I tried to discreetly crack my window a bit more. "No problem," said Jack. "We can take you as far as the next town. Where you headed?" The man settled into the back seat, still smiling that unsettling grin. "Oh, just up the coast a ways. Wherever you fine folks are going is great." I turned slightly so I could keep an eye on him in my peripheral vision. Something about him was making me uneasy, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. We drove in awkward silence for a few minutes. I could feel the man's eyes on the back of my head. Jack tried to make conversation. "So, what brings you out this way?" he asked. The man chuckled. "Oh, you know, just seeing the sights, getting away from it all for a while." There was an edge to his voice that made me tense up. "Right, cool," said Jack. "We're on our honeymoon, actually. Just got married last—" "Married!" the man interrupted loudly, making me jump. "Well, ain't that sweet? Young love. Beautiful thing." His tone didn't match his words at all. He sounded almost angry. I glanced at Jack, seeing my own nervousness reflected in his eyes. "How long you two lovebirds been together?" the man asked, leaning forward between the seats. I could smell his rancid breath. About 3 years, I said quietly, trying to lean away without being obvious. 3 years, he repeated flatly. "That's nice, real nice." Suddenly, his demeanor changed completely. The fake cheerfulness vanished, replaced by a cold, hard stare. "You know what's funny?" he said in a low voice. "My wife and I were together 15 years before she left me. 15 goddamn years." I felt Jack tense beside me. The atmosphere in the car had shifted dramatically. "I'm sorry to hear that," Jack said carefully. "That must have been difficult." The man barked out a harsh laugh. "Difficult? Yeah, you could say that. Ripped my fucking heart out is what she did." I was starting to panic now. This guy was clearly unstable. I wished we had never stopped to pick him up. Maybe we should, I started to say, but the man cut me off. You want to know the real kicker? He snarled, his face contorted with rage. She left me for my best friend. My best friend. Can you believe that shit? Before either of us could respond, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a gun. My heart nearly stopped. Whoa, hey, take it easy, Jack said, his voice shaking. We don't want any trouble. The man waved the gun between us. Trouble? Oh, we're way past trouble, pretty boy. Pull over, now. Jack hesitated, clearly torn between complying and trying to get away. The man noticed and pressed the gun to the back of Jack's head. I said pull over, he screamed, or I'll paint the windshield with your brains. Jack quickly steered onto the shoulder, gravel crunching under the tires. I was frozen in terror, unable to even cry out. Good, the man growled. Now both of you, hands where I can see 'em. No funny business. We raised our hands, mine shaking uncontrollably. I couldn't believe this was happening. How had our perfect honeymoon turned into this nightmare? Please, I managed to whisper. Please don't hurt us. We'll give you whatever you want. The man laughed cruelly. What I want? What I want is my life back, my wife back. But I can't have that, can I? He was growing more agitated by the second, waving the gun erratically. I was certain he was going to kill us. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the sound of gunshots. But then, in a moment of either insanity or incredible bravery, Jack made his move. In one swift motion, he threw the car into drive and stomped on the gas pedal. We lurched forward violently. The man was thrown off balance, tumbling into the back seat. His gun went off, the deafening bang making my ears ring. The bullet shattered the rear window. Go, 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 I screamed, though Jack needed no encouragement. He was flooring it, the engine roaring as we tore down the highway. In the rearview mirror, I could see the man struggling to right himself, cursing and yelling incoherently. He raised the gun again, firing wildly. Bullets pinged off the trunk and blew out the back tires. The car fishtailed dangerously, but Jack somehow kept control. We were going over 100 mph now, the ruined tires squealing and smoking. I turned to look behind us just in time to see the man kick open the back door. For a terrifying moment, I thought he was going to hang on. But then he tumbled out onto the road, rolling several times before coming to a stop in a crumpled heap. Oh my God, I gasped. Is he? Don't look, Jack said grimly, still laser-focused on the road ahead. Just keep your eyes forward. We need to find somewhere safe. We drove for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 20 or 30 minutes. The adrenaline slowly faded, leaving me shaky and nauseous. I couldn't stop replaying those horrifying moments in my mind. Finally, we came upon a small town, and Jack pulled into the parking lot of a rundown motel. We sat there for a long moment, both of us trembling. "Are you okay?" Jack asked, reaching for my hand. "Did you get hit?" I shook my head, realizing I had been so scared I hadn't even checked myself for injuries. "No, I don't think so. You?" "I'm all right," he said, though I could hear the shock in his voice. Jesus Christ, that really happened, didn't it? I nodded mutely, the tears finally coming. Jack pulled me into his arms and we clung to each other, both of us sobbing with fear and relief. Eventually, we gathered ourselves enough to go into the motel office and get a room. The clerk gave us some odd looks. We must have appeared quite a sight with our wild eyes and bullet-riddled car. But thankfully, he didn't ask any questions. We spent a sleepless night huddled together in the musty motel room, jumping at every little sound. In the morning, we called the police and gave our statement. They found our attacker's body on the side of the highway, but never identified him. It's been 2 years since that terrible day, and I still have nightmares about it. Our honeymoon was ruined, of course. We flew home early and spent weeks in therapy trying to process the trauma. Sometimes I wonder about that man, who he was, what drove him to such desperation and violence. But mostly, I'm just incredibly grateful that we survived. Jack and I have a stronger bond now, having gone through that nightmare together. But I don't think I'll ever feel truly safe on the open road again.